Back again, are we? You must have a taste for the terrifying. Tonight, we'll explore a story so chilling, it'll make you second-guess every shadow that creeps in your home. This happened in the early summer of 2020, right when COVID was at its peak. I'm sure most of you can relate to staying at home during quarantine and not being able to go out. With the constant boredom of staying locked away inside of my house, I decided to take a day for a fishing trip. I live in South Florida, a place where it's notorious to go fishing. My state was still on lockdown, but I didn't care. I drove about an hour's drive away to Key West and went under a bridge to where I was sure I would get a decent catch. The waves were a little rough, but it didn't matter. Fast forward to about 30 minutes later, I'm still fishing, waiting for a bite. I look to my left and see what appeared to be a blue tarp setup behind one of the pillars of the bridge. I thought nothing of it, but for whatever reason, I looked back and saw a man standing there looking at me. To be honest, he kind of startled me as I jumped a little bit and nodded my head as a hello. However, he didn't seem to acknowledge my greeting as he kept staring at me with this blank expression I couldn't even describe. By the looks of it, he looked homeless, worn, torn clothes and had a full-on white beard, kind of like what you would picture as your typical old fisherman. What made me unsettled, however, was that his right hand was always behind his back. I pretended to concentrate on fishing, but I could still feel his gaze looking at me. Suddenly, he then jumps into the water and is swimming directly toward me. Even with the rough waves and the current from under the bridge, he was extremely fast. I was out from under that bridge in less than 15 seconds and got in my car with my foot glued to the gas pedal. I also left my stuff behind as, obviously, my life was more worth saving than that. I drove about a few miles where I stopped at a gas station for a snack and then proceeded to go home. What that man was going to do to me or what he wanted, I don't know. I assumed he was probably a dangerous homeless person who didn't like people near where he lived. The next day, I drove back to the bridge and tried to get my stuff, only to find it gone. Not only that, but the blue tarp and the man were also gone. Nothing was left except for an old hunting knife left on one of the platforms where the pillars were held up. After seeing it, I knew that's probably what he was hiding behind his back. This happened in the early summer of 2020, right when COVID was at its peak. I'm sure most of you can relate to staying at home during quarantine and not being able to go out. With the constant boredom of staying locked away inside of my house, I decided to take a day for a fishing trip. My name is Edgar. I'm 17 years old now, but the events that I'm about to tell you happened about 5 years ago. It started with me and my grandfather Richard. We were going fishing just like we had many times before in our little boat in the middle of the lake. I loved those moments with my grandfather. It was relaxing, and he would tell me stories all day long. One day, it all changed, however, a day I wish never happened. Still, after 5 years, I'm not forgetting any details. It still burned deep into my mind. It started out normal enough. We gathered our fishing gear, got it in the back of our truck, and hopped in. We headed out for the lake, and the drive went by smoothly. After we got there, we transferred all our gear from the truck into the boat and got in ourselves, letting the water carry the boat as we made our way a bit deeper. It was beautiful out in the water, surrounded by nature, our boat gently rocking left and right. It was a great lifestyle, and we both loved it. As we were casting our fishing rods, my grandpa telling me one of his stories, I noticed something glinting a bit in front of our boat. I pointed it out to my grandfather, who decided to try and fish it out. Maybe it was a necklace or something, and we thought that it would be cool if we found something like that in the water. As my grandfather cast his line and started to roll it back, I could see he didn't catch the shiny object. He did catch something, though. I could see it even under the water. As he pulled the object out, we could both see that it was a bone. Weird, we thought, but nothing out of the ordinary. It was small enough to be a fish bone or something, so we just cast a line again. This time, however, the line seemed to struggle with the weight, but we could see the shiny object coming up. As he was bringing it out, I could see the object was attached to something bigger, but in the water, I thought it could just be some random trash laying around. As he got it out of the water, however, it all changed. What we saw in front of us was, without a doubt, a human skull, and there was a pendant attached around one of its eye sockets. My grandfather quickly tossed the fishing rod from his hands, and he wanted to go home immediately. We didn't bring cell phones, so we had to get back home to call the police. We made it back, and in a rush, we jumped into the truck as he sped off. It was slowly starting to get dark as we made our way home, the forest surrounding us. I thought I could see a shadowy figure running along our side in the forest on multiple occasions. I didn't bring it up to my grandpa, however, because it looked like it was a humanoid but running on 4 legs, and I was sure humans can't run that fast, so I just thought it was my imagination because I was scared. When we got home, my grandpa called the police and told them where the lake was and that there was a fishing pole there too. Some officers came to our house to get a report, and we explained how we came across it. They thanked us for our time and were on their way as me and my grandfather watched behind. That night, I had trouble sleeping, waking up multiple times to see a shadowy figure in the corner of my room, just for it to be gone after I blinked again. I woke up the next morning feeling tired, like I had just run a marathon instead of sleeping. I went downstairs, and my mom had already cooked me some waffles for breakfast, which made the morning a bit more bearable. I loved waffles. I finished up eating and headed outside to play with my friends, but I could never shake the feeling of being watched. When I brought it up to my friends, they would say that they felt normal and that I'm just paranoid. I believed them. I hadn't seen anything, after all, and I was ruining fun for myself and them because of my paranoia. It still didn't help. In fact, every day that went by, the feeling became stronger and more frequent. It had gotten to the point where I didn't want to leave the house at all, because I was feeling unsafe. When my grandfather saw me acting strange, he asked me what was wrong. "I don't know, Grandpa. I saw something moving parallel to our car when we were coming back from that lake," I said, expecting him to comfort me and say how everything is going to be fine. What I saw instead was a pure look of terror and panic on my grandfather's face as he got up and frantically paced around the room. They followed us. I should have known they'd follow us. They never found that damned skull. It was a trap all along, he said as I saw a couple of tears forming in his eyes. "Why the hell did you tell me this now, huh? Why didn't you tell me earlier?" he yelled as I started to cry, thinking I had done something terrible. "I'm sorry, Grandpa. I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me because I was scared. I couldn't, I trailed off as tears coated my cheeks and dripped from my face. My grandpa didn't even look at me as he headed for the stairs. "We're doomed," I could hear him mumble as he made his way up. I couldn't sleep at all that night. I felt guilty. I didn't know why my grandfather was so upset. Sure, I could sometimes see a figure in the shadows or feel something watching me, but it never affected me otherwise. When it was about 4 a.m. and I could finally feel my eyes getting heavy, I could hear some sort of chanting sound mixed with buzzing. Right after that, I heard a loud crash in the hallway. I didn't know what it was, but I was too scared to look. I stayed in my bed until I heard my mom scream loudly. I jumped out of bed, not caring about the fear anymore, thinking something bad had happened to my mother. As I rushed out to the hallway, I saw my mother crying over my grandpa, who was lying on the floor. When I got closer, I saw the reason she was crying. My grandpa looked like he had drowned, blue color enveloping his skin, his clothes wet. I couldn't hold my vomit in any longer. I puked all over the floor, feeling nauseous and lightheaded as I passed out. I woke up in my room, my mother sitting next to me on a chair. She hugged me after I woke up and cried on my shoulder. I asked her if Grandpa was dead, and she just nodded her head. His lungs were full of water. No one knows how it happened or how he got to the hallway in that condition. It was all a mystery. My mother did, however, report that she heard whispered chants along with buzzing. After I told her I heard the same thing, she was shocked, thinking it was all in her head from the lack of sleep she'd been getting recently. We both went to bed that night, my eyes growing heavy as soon as I laid down on the bed. I dozed off almost immediately from exhaustion, but I was awoken by the sound of whispered chanting and buzzing coming from the hallway. Thinking it was whatever had killed my grandfather, I stayed in my room, silent as the night outside my house. That was until about 20 minutes later, I once again heard my mother scream and then gurgle like she was drowning. I jumped out of bed again, but as soon as I reached for the door, the sound stopped. As I opened it, I could see my mother in the same state my grandfather was the night before, blue skin, wet clothes. I started crying uncontrollably for hours until I finally found myself going to the phone and dialing 911. An ambulance and police officers came. I don't remember any of it. The funeral, those couple of days went by in a blur. I found myself in a foster home right up until last month. They let me come back to my property because I was turning 18 soon. As I'm recording this, there is a sound in front of my door. It sounds like whisper chanting and buzzing. I think they are waiting until 12 a.m. when I turn 18. This is probably my last day here, and I wanted to post this as a warning to everyone. If there is a shiny object in the water while you're fishing, turn around and go home. It's not worth it. I live in South Florida, a place where it's notorious to go fishing. My state was still on lockdown, but I didn't care. I drove about an hour's drive away to Key West and went under a bridge to where I was sure I would get a decent catch. The waves were a little rough, but it didn't matter. Fast forward to about 30 minutes later, I'm still fishing, waiting for a bite. I look to my left and see what appeared to be a blue tarp setup behind one of the pillars of the bridge. I thought nothing of it, but for whatever reason, I looked back and saw a man standing there looking at me. To be honest, he kind of startled me as I jumped a little bit and nodded my head as a hello. However, he didn't seem to acknowledge my greeting as he kept staring at me with this blank expression I couldn't even describe. By the looks of it, he looked homeless, worn, torn clothes and had a full-on white beard, kind of like what you would picture as your typical old fisherman. What made me unsettled, however, was that his right hand was always behind his back. I pretended to concentrate on fishing, but I could still feel his gaze looking at me. Suddenly, he then jumps into the water and is swimming directly toward me. Even with the rough waves and the current from under the bridge, he was extremely fast. I was out from under that bridge in less than 15 seconds and got in my car with my foot glued to the gas pedal. I also left my stuff behind as, obviously, my life was more worth saving than that. I drove about a few miles where I stopped at a gas station for a snack and then proceeded to go home. What that man was going to do to me or what he wanted, I don't know. I assumed he was probably a dangerous homeless person who didn't like people near where he lived. The next day, I drove back to the bridge and tried to get my stuff, only to find it gone. Not only that, but the blue tarp and the man were also gone. Nothing was left except for an old hunting knife left on one of the platforms where the pillars were held up. After seeing it, I knew that's probably what he was hiding behind his back. This happened when I was in my late 30s on a fishing trip to celebrate a promotion I had received from my job. Throughout my young adult years, I've always been out on the water and never once had come across anything or had a reason to be afraid. However, this one night of the trip took my fascination with fishing and crushed it. The night of my trip, I had stopped my boat to save fuel and found myself on my boat watching over the ocean. It was a quiet and calm night, and there was no land for miles, just the sound of the calm waves hitting the boat. So there I was, sitting on top of my boat somewhere in the mid-Atlantic, when I saw something. I got out my binoculars, and with the light from the moon, I was able to see something bobbing along the water. Because of how dark it was too difficult to see just what it was. My first thought was to get my wife, who was sleeping, but I didn't want to wake her. The closer it got, I then made it out to be a raft of some type, tied together with bamboo and a tarp strapped to it. Upon this raft was not a single soul. The chances of coming across a raft this far out at sea were small enough. In this part of the ocean, the scary part about this was thinking about the person or people who once sailed that raft, why they sailed, and how they met their fate. That is what stuck with me. There's a nice hidden lake a short walk away from my house in Parson Field, Maine. I've been going fishing there for as long as I've lived here. It's hidden away from any roads or houses, it has perfect privacy, and I would always be the only one out on the lake fishing. In fact, I would leave my kayak in the same spot by the lake whenever I wasn't using it. It was easier than lugging the thing back and forth through my house to the lake anytime I wanted to use it. I would leave it leaning up against this huge tree every time. The kayak is heavy enough to not fall over from a windstorm or anything. I also leave it covered to prevent critters from taking refuge inside. It was a warm summer's evening. I was out on the lake already for about an hour and I'd caught a few trout already, which I'd thrown into the cooler. It was dusk at this point, the little bit of light left in the sky was disappearing behind the trees. I was going to bring it in soon and just then, I heard sounds from the edge of the lake. I turned and saw someone standing at the edge of the water, tipping a barrel of some kind over, pouring its contents into the lake. It looked to me like they were polluting the lake with something. I took it upon myself to yell out, "Excuse me, what are you doing?" The person looked up at me and then ran into the woods with the contents of the barrels still pouring into the water. I looked more closely at the liquid being poured out into the lake, and it looked like a dark red liquid, though it was dark out, so I can't say with 100% certainty if it was red, but it was very dark. I felt a sense of unease creep up throughout my body. I decided I wanted to leave. I'm a big nature guy though, and seeing people littering or polluting the environment makes me sick. I genuinely couldn't resist shouting something out to that person, but I didn't feel comfortable here any longer. I planned on reporting this to the Department of Environmental Protection. I paddled the kayak back to my usual spot. I took all of my gear off the kayak before pulling it out of the water. As I was putting the cover over the kayak, I heard one single snap of something not far away, like the crunch of something under a person's shoe. I turned and was about to say, "Who's there?" but I decided against it. I finished covering the kayak quicker than I ever had before. I didn't even bother standing it up to lean on the tree this time, I left it on the ground. I picked up my gear and cooler and started quickly walking out of the woods and out to the road which led to my house. It was only a couple minutes of a walk and I was back home. I kept looking over my shoulder the entire time, thinking someone was behind me. I put my gear in the shed real quick, then went inside. I never locked the door so quickly. I was genuinely spooked. I rinsed off the trout and put them in the fridge, planning on cooking them tomorrow. Tonight, I just heated up some leftovers. As the food was in the microwave, there was a knock at my front door. The fear and dread that I was feeling the entire walk back to the house returned in an instant, and my suspicion that I was being followed home was basically confirmed. I mean, who else would be knocking on my door this late? My lights were on, my car was in the driveway, whoever it was knew I was in here. I had all the shades closed though, so nobody could look inside. They knocked on the door again. The microwave beeped as the timer hit 0. I'm sure whoever was outside heard it. All the windows were cracked open and a moment later, there was a knock now on the window and a man's voice said through the window, "Excuse me, I think you saw me at the lake earlier." I'd just like to explain myself. There was absolutely no chance I was opening the door to this person. For them to stalk me to my house told me this was a dangerous person. They repeatedly knocked on the window and kept yelling, "Hello," through it. I decided to acknowledge him now that he was getting more aggressive. I yelled, "Yo, leave or I'll call the police." I intended to either way, but it was still a threat to get him to leave. The man responded calmly now, saying, "Sir, if you could just open the front door, I'll explain everything to you." I repeated my threat, and I didn't hear his voice again. At this point, I shut and locked every window in the house and turned on the AC. I also made a report to the non-emergency police number, detailing both the barrel being dumped into the lake and the man coming to my house. I also made an online report with the Department of Environmental Protection. Making these 2 reports honestly made me feel a little better about going to sleep that night. But thank God I'm a light sleeper. In the middle of the night, around 2 a.m., I heard a crash from downstairs. I immediately sprang out of my bed and grabbed my Glock from the closet. I heard someone's attempt at quiet footsteps coming up the creaky wooden steps. I had my Glock loaded in hand as I stood behind my dresser right by my closet, aiming at the door. I heard very slow creeping towards my door. My bedroom door is closest to the stairs, so it was naturally the first door that they would approach. And sure enough, I heard the doorknob slowly press down and then the door pushed open. I saw nothing but the man's silhouette enter the room. I flicked on the lamp next to me so he could see my gun, and I screamed, "Get on the ground now." He raised his hands in the air and seemed for a second to be motioning for me to calm down. He had a small blade in his hand. I told him to drop it, but then he said calmly, "I'm leaving," and he turned and ran for downstairs. I yelled at him to stop, but he clearly took the chance on me being too afraid to pull the trigger. I heard him leave through the front door. I ran downstairs to lock the front door right away and then called 911. My living room window was shattered, glass was all over the floor. I kept my sight on that broken window until the police officer showed up. I had to explain that I already made a non-emergency report of what happened earlier, in fear of waiting too long by morning for the barrel to be gone in the darkness. I went with 2 of the officers who showed up to my house to where I saw that man dumping the barrel into the lake, but after 20 minutes of walking around looking for it, it was gone. The man must have made sure not to leave it behind. I gave my best description of the man to the police for their report. The man was a short, bearded white man with a receding hairline and glasses, wearing a black flannel shirt and black pants. After the police left, I stayed in the living room all night with my gun next to me, watching TV. No way in hell was I going to sleep with a broken window and some nut job out there. At dawn, my brothers came over to help me fix the window. My brother Azaria stayed at the house while my other brother and I went to Home Depot to get the window and parts. Azaria stayed at the house with me for a few nights till things cooled down. My not-so-wild theory is that the barrel contained human remains, possibly dissolved in some kind of acid. Why else would that man follow me home and then break into my house to potentially murder me? Trust your gut if something feels wrong. I knew if I opened my door to that man, something terrible might have happened to me. Ever since I was a little kid, all the older men in my family would take me fishing every opportunity they got. It was like some family ritual. I, being the youngest, meant that I was next in line to become an expert like all of them claimed to be. The ones who took it the most seriously were my dad and his brother Eugene. Our houses were decked out like the ones you've probably seen on fishing shows. I won't go into detail, but if you took a step into my house, you'd instantly be able to tell my parents spend more time on the water than on the land. This is actually his story, not mine. My dad's a pretty hard guy to scare, but let me tell you, whenever he tells the story, it's like he's a different person. He doesn't like talking about it, but every so often at a family gathering or a special occasion, one of my relatives will ask him to tell it, and he will. My dad's name is Gwyn. He was fishing with my uncle Eugene and their close friends Clytus, Dylan, and Lagan. They had set out early before the sun had even broken the horizon, heading to a remote spot they had all agreed was prime fishing territory. This place was a couple of hours boat ride from the nearest marina, tucked away in a secluded cove-type area that few bother to explore. It was known among them for its abundant bass and the occasional pike. The day started like any other fishing trip, with the boat cutting smoothly through the mist rising off the water, everyone sharing stories and jokes over the hum of the engine. They anchored the boat in a familiar cove surrounded by dense forest. Lagan was the first to crack open a beer, even though it was so early in the morning. My dad tells me all the time that Lagan is his wild friend, the one who tends to drink a little more than he should. They fished for hours, the only sounds being the occasional splash of a lure hitting the water and their own laughter, and the occasional crunch of empty beer cans that they were drinking like water. As the day wore on, they had their fair share of catches, each one sparking a small celebration. As dusk approached, the light began to wane. A dense fog rolled in from the water. My dad describes it as the boat literally being swallowed by fog. Clytus, who was the most experienced fisherman of the group, kept saying that he had never seen fog so thick. That's how unnatural it was. Dylan, the jester of the group, was almost as drunk as Lagan, both of whom were seemingly unfazed by the fog that had ensnared them. It was starting to get dark. They had originally thought that they could just wait out the fog, but it didn't seem to be going anywhere. My dad and Clytus agreed that Eugene should just try to drive the boat out of the cove and into the open ocean, where the fog probably wouldn't be as dense. Eugene agreed, but even though he was typically the most cautious, he only narrowly avoided colliding with the shore. He refused to risk further damage to his prized boat. They reluctantly came to terms with the fact that they'd probably have to spend the night on the boat. My dad made the point that they'd need to tell their families about the situation, and of course, they had drifted into an area of the cove that had no signal. My dad needed to handle some business at work, so neglecting the problem was not an option. He offered to go ashore in search of a signal, and Clytus and Dylan said they'd join him. Eugene would stay back to guard the boat and an increasingly inebriated Lagan. My dad, Dylan, and Clytus made their way over to the shore and jumped out of the boat, only getting slightly wet. My dad made a point of snagging the emergency flares in the boat, just in case they got lost and needed to signal Eugene to come find them. The three of them made their way into the pitch-black woods, lit only by the shine of their phone flashlights. My dad and his friends have all done their fair share of camping, so it wasn't like a forest scared them too much. They began trekking uphill, hoping that higher ground would give them a better chance of finding a signal. My dad always made a point of emphasizing how dark yet eerily foggy the forest was. You could practically feel yourself slicing through the fog just as they were adjusting to the dense atmosphere. A series of strange clicking noises began to permeate the silence, first emerging from directly in front of them before encircling them completely. These sounds were unlike any forest sounds they were familiar with. It was rhythmic yet erratic, as if someone was tapping out a code meant only for the woods themselves. The distinctiveness of the noise made one thing clear: it was human-made. The realization that they weren't alone hit them like a freight train. Clytus, the most seasoned of the trio when it came to outdoor survival, whispered urgently for them to turn off their flashlights. "Don't give away our position," he hissed, with a note of genuine concern in his voice. As the light switched off, the darkness became thicker than the fog. The clicking noises stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence that seemed to weigh on their chests. Time lost meaning as they stood there, frozen, unsure of their next move. I'm sure they were all thinking the same thing. The idea that they might have stumbled upon some kind of clandestine gathering or a woods cult was terrifying. Then, as suddenly as it had stopped, the silence was broken by rustling noises, this time much closer. Then silence again. And then a guttural scream echoed through the trees, a sound so primal and full of anguish that it rooted them to the spot. Before they could process what was happening, rapid stomping noises thundered through the woods towards them. The three men took off back the way they had come, acting on fear and pure instinct. My dad fired the flare gun behind them. The flare cut through the fog, lighting the woods up for a moment. The woods were as clear as day, and the sight that met their eyes was nothing short of horrifying. Illuminated by the flare's red glow was a pack of more than 10 individuals dressed in what could only be described as tribal attire. Some of them brandished wooden spears, but the light from the flare only lasted a split second. Dylan screamed and almost stumbled, but Clytus quickly grabbed his arm to keep him upright. My dad describes this part as the most overwhelming feeling of pure terror he has ever experienced. The forest seemed to fight against them as they fled, ducking under branches and jumping over roots. By some miracle, they emerged from the tree line, panting and disoriented but alive. They screamed at Eugene to start the engine, the urgency in their voices leaving no room for question. Eugene complied immediately, and the boat lurched forward just as their pursuers reached the shoreline. In the chaos, my dad fired the last flare into the air back towards the shore. For a split second, as the flare's light pierced the fog, they saw their pursuers at the water's edge. It was freakish. There must have been at least 15 of them just standing motionless at the water's edge. The flare's light faded, and it was dark again. Eugene managed to get a safe distance away and stop the boat again. After the engine was off, the only sounds were Dylan, my dad, and Clytus's breathing. My dad says he wasn't able to process what had happened for nearly an hour. He was functioning off pure adrenaline and survival instincts. They ended up taking turns keeping watch while the others slept and left first thing in the morning as soon as the fog dissipated. Funnily enough, Lagan had passed out before everything went down and doesn't remember any of the details of that night. I still get shivers down my spine when I tell this story. I can only imagine what my dad must feel when he thinks back to it. Ever since I was a little kid, all the older men in my family would take me fishing every opportunity they got. It was like some family ritual. I, being the youngest, meant that I was next in line to become an expert like all of them claimed to be. The ones who took it the most seriously were my dad and his brother Eugene. Our houses were decked out like the ones you've probably seen on fishing shows. I won't go into detail, but if you took a step into my house, you'd instantly be able to tell my parents spend more time on the water than on the land. This is actually his story, not mine. My dad's a pretty hard guy to scare, but let me tell you, whenever he tells the story, it's like he's a different person. He doesn't like talking about it, but every so often at a family gathering or a special occasion, one of my relatives will ask him to tell it, and he will. My dad's name is Gwyn. He was fishing with my uncle Eugene and their close friends Clytus, Dylan, and Lagan. They had set out early before the sun had even broken the horizon, heading to a remote spot they had all agreed was prime fishing territory. This place was a couple of hours boat ride from the nearest marina, tucked away in a secluded cove-type area that few bothered to explore. It was known among them for its abundant bass and the occasional pike. The day started like any other fishing trip, with the boat cutting smoothly through the mist rising off the water, everyone sharing stories and jokes over the hum of the engine. They anchored the boat in a familiar cove surrounded by dense forest. Lagan was the first to crack open a beer, even though it was so early in the morning. My dad tells me all the time that Lagan is his wild friend, the one who tends to drink a little more than he should. They fished for hours, the only sounds being the occasional splash of a lure hitting the water and their own laughter, and the occasional crunch of empty beer cans that they were drinking like water. As the day wore on, they had their fair share of catches, each one sparking a small celebration. As dusk approached, the light began to wane. A dense fog rolled in from the water. My dad describes it as the boat literally being swallowed by fog. Clytus, who was the most experienced fisherman of the group, kept saying that he had never seen fog so thick. That's how unnatural it was. Dylan, the jester of the group, was almost as drunk as Lagan, both of whom were seemingly unfazed by the fog that had ensnared them. It was starting to get dark. They had originally thought that they could just wait out the fog, but it didn't seem to be going anywhere. My dad and Clytus agreed that Eugene should just try to drive the boat out of the cove and into the open ocean, where the fog probably wouldn't be as dense. Eugene agreed, but even though he was typically the most cautious, he only narrowly avoided colliding with the shore. He refused to risk further damage to his prized boat. They reluctantly came to terms with the fact that they'd probably have to spend the night on the boat. My dad made the point that they'd need to tell their families about the situation, and of course, they had drifted into an area of the cove that had no signal. My dad needed to handle some business at work, so neglecting the problem was not an option. He offered to go ashore in search of a signal, and Clytus and Dylan said they'd join him. Eugene would stay back to guard the boat and an increasingly inebriated Lagan. My dad, Dylan, and Clytus made their way over to the shore and jumped out of the boat, only getting slightly wet. My dad made a point of snagging the emergency flares in the boat, just in case they got lost and needed to signal Eugene to come find them. The three of them made their way into the pitch-black woods, lit only by the shine of their phone flashlights. My dad and his friends have all done their fair share of camping, so it wasn't like a forest scared them too much. They began trekking uphill, hoping that higher ground would give them a better chance of finding a signal. My dad always made a point of emphasizing how dark yet eerily foggy the forest was. You could practically feel yourself slicing through the fog just as they were adjusting to the dense atmosphere. A series of strange clicking noises began to permeate the silence, first emerging from directly in front of them before encircling them completely. These sounds were unlike any forest sounds they were familiar with. It was rhythmic yet erratic, as if someone was tapping out a code meant only for the woods themselves. The distinctiveness of the noise made one thing clear: it was human-made. The realization that they weren't alone hit them like a freight train. Clytus, the most seasoned of the trio when it came to outdoor survival, whispered urgently for them to turn off their flashlights. "Don't give away our position," he hissed, with a note of genuine concern in his voice. As the lights switched off, the darkness became thicker than the fog. The clicking noises stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence that seemed to weigh on their chests. Time lost meaning as they stood there, frozen, unsure of their next move. I'm sure they were all thinking the same thing. The idea that they might have stumbled upon some kind of clandestine gathering or a woods cult was terrifying. Then, as suddenly as it had stopped, the silence was broken by rustling noises, this time much closer. Then silence again. And then a guttural scream echoed through the trees, a sound so primal and full of anguish that it rooted them to the spot. Before they could process what was happening, rapid stomping noises thundered through the woods towards them. The three men took off back the way they had come, acting on fear and pure instinct. My dad fired the flare gun behind them. The flare cut through the fog, lighting the woods up for a moment. The woods were as clear as day, and the sight that met their eyes was nothing short of horrifying. Illuminated by the flare's red glow was a pack of more than 10 individuals dressed in what could only be described as tribal attire. Some of them brandished wooden spears, but the light from the flare only lasted a split second. Dylan screamed and almost stumbled, but Clytus quickly grabbed his arm to keep him upright. My dad describes this part as the most overwhelming feeling of pure terror he has ever experienced. The forest seemed to fight against them as they fled, ducking under branches and jumping over roots. By some miracle, they emerged from the tree line, panting and disoriented but alive. They screamed at Eugene to start the engine, the urgency in their voices leaving no room for question. Eugene complied immediately, and the boat lurched forward just as their pursuers reached the shoreline. In the chaos, my dad fired the last flare into the air back towards the shore. For a split second, as the flare's light pierced the fog, they saw their pursuers at the water's edge. It was freakish. There must have been at least 15 of them just standing motionless at the water's edge. The flare's light faded, and it was dark again. Eugene managed to get a safe distance away and stop the boat again. After the engine was off, the only sounds were Dylan, my dad, and Clytus's breathing. My dad says he wasn't able to process what had happened for nearly an hour. He was functioning off pure adrenaline and survival instincts. They ended up taking turns keeping watch while the others slept and left first thing in the morning as soon as the fog dissipated. That I've been fishing for as long as I can remember. I'm almost 60 years old now, and even though I've been fishing thousands of times, I can't think of any other way I'd rather spend the rest of my life. My kids are all off living their own lives, and things around the house are quiet now. You could hear a pin drop most of the time. Sometimes I miss the old days, being able to throw the pigskin around with my boys in the backyard, but some things just aren't in the game plan anymore. I usually fish with my pals from college, but more often than not, I find myself going at it alone, like a lone wolf. This was one of those times. I haven't stepped foot outside upstate New York in over 15 years. I don't see a reason to. We've got some of the best fishing lakes in the country, and I plan on making full use of them. It was mid-April, in the early season, just after the ice out and before May hit. For whatever reason, I decided I wanted a more secluded spot this time around, so I chose a nondescript lake in the middle of nowhere that was pretty small. I drove up an hour before sunrise so that I could be out on the water when the sun poked through. I unstrapped my kayak from the roof of the car and made my way over to the lake. I rode out to the middle of the lake and admired the beautiful early colors starting to paint the sky. It felt like home. You can bet your bottom dollar I'd never trade a day like this for anything. It was a little chilly, but I've got skin like steel. I could tell the sun was just about to appear in the sky, so I started gearing up. I was shooting for a largemouth bass, so I made my way back to the outside edge of the weed beds, planning to move back toward the middle of the lake if I got skunked. I went for a 6 and 1/2 foot medium action spinning rod with 9 pounds monofilament line. I was using a wacky rig, which is a 4-inch rubber stick worm, my go-to for catching largemouth. Just before I was about to start what would hopefully be a swell day on the water, I noticed something strange. Across the lake, I couldn't quite see what was going on, but I could tell that there was movement. At first, I thought it was a fellow fisherman, but curiosity got the better of me. I reached into my knapsack and pulled out my pair of binoculars I used for bird watching. I looked across the lake and saw 3 figures wearing dark colors and hoods covering their faces. They looked like they were digging a hole or something on the edge of the lake. I kept watching. They finished their hole, and while I was expecting them to put something inside it, they actually did the opposite. One of them pulled something out of the hole, which I couldn't make out even with my binoculars. Then the other 2 did the same, pulling out a few more things that I couldn't quite see. I was beyond confused. Then I watched as they started tossing the items into the lake, each one making a distinct splash as it smacked the water. Something was wrong. Out of nowhere, a wave of fear washed over me. I didn't know who these people were, but I started thinking they might be dangerous. I didn't know what to do. Thankfully, they started to leave without noticing me. I thought about turning a blind eye but couldn't bring myself to do it. I waited until they disappeared into the woods and slowly rowed my way over. I was shaking at this point. I got to the spot where I was pretty sure they had tossed everything. I started fishing, only this time I wasn't fishing for fish, I was going for something else entirely. I fished around for about an hour with no luck. I had to try something different. I racked my brain, trying to figure out what I could do, and just then I remembered my depth checker. I had it tucked away in my Volvo. I was determined at this point. I rowed back to shore, returned to my car, retrieved the depth checker, and rowed back to the spot. I was sweating heavily at this point. I poked around for a bit, feeling nothing but the squishy lake bottom, and then I felt something hard, something metal. I made a mental note of the spot and grabbed my rod. I took the rig off and replaced it with the largest hook I had. I let the spool out slowly, my pointer finger feeling the gentle movement of the line. 50 years of fishing experience was going into this one catch. I felt the slight resistance in the line, it had hit something. I moved the line around slowly, hoping I'd be able to snag it on whatever was down there. After about a minute, the line tugged a little harder than was normal. I was snagged. I reeled in slowly, careful not to drop my catch. What I pulled out of the water had me shivering in my boots. I stared at the black 9mm on the end of my line. Those thugs had thrown a gun into the lake. I didn't feel safe anymore. I didn't even bother looking around for the other items. I reeled the gun into my kayak, careful not to touch it, and hightailed it out of there. As soon as I got to dry land, I called the police. They launched a full investigation and recovered several more unsettling things from the lake. I insisted on watching them conduct their search because I needed to know what was at the bottom of that lake. They found a keychain with about 7 keys on it and a bunch of old foreign coins from different countries wrapped in a cloth. The most eerie thing they found, though, was a locket. It was waterlogged, so the pictures inside were faded and unintelligible. The police told me they'd contact me if they ever connected these dots to some kind of crime. They never called me, though. But the story didn't end there. One night, I don't remember how many days after this incident, I heard someone in my front yard say, "That was the car, I know it," and then people snooping around my yard. They never rang the bell or knocked on the door, but I heard multiple people circling my house, and then they just left. I have no idea if they were the same people, and if they were, I have no idea if I'm being watched any time I leave my house. I alerted the police once more, hoping this would reopen the investigation, but nothing became of it once again. I still have so many questions. Why would those items be buried in the first place, and why would those people go back just to dig them up and hide them again? Maybe they realized that there was a greater chance they'd be found in the ground, so they went back and threw them in the lake. Or maybe those items had been in that hole for years, and they decided to dig them up for some reason. All in all, this was the strangest thing that has ever happened to me while fishing. Throughout my life, I would go through phases of different hobbies. I'd pick something that interests me, obsess over it for a year or so, and then find something new to keep myself entertained. During the summer of 2022, I was big into fishing. About an hour's drive away is a shore house my family has owned for decades that's on the water with a lagoon and a small Boston whaler. My friends and I would take frequent trips there to fish and just chill. It was the following October, after summer, when my 2 friends, Asher and Victor, decided to hit the shore house for a weekend to try to catch some striper, as they're abundant during the fall months. Asher was an avid fisherman, which was a big reason why I got into the whole fishing craze in the first place. Unfortunately, during this time, our boat was out of the water due to maintenance, so we'd have to fish off the beach and piers. This was no problem, though, as Asher had all the necessary rods and gear to do so. We got together on a Friday afternoon and I drove us all down. When we got there, we fished during the day off of different piers along the inlet. Night rolled by, and only one of us had caught a fish, which was Asher, of course. It was just a small bass though, nothing too exciting. Bummed about our luck, we decided to stay up late to fish off the beach during the night. Asher said he knew a good beach spot about 20 minutes away, which took us down a desolate road with woods on both sides. It opened up into a small gravel parking area, or at least what seemed like one. Asher said since we'd have to walk a little ways to the spot, we should take everything we need now so we wouldn't have to go back to the car to get anything. We planned on staying up to catch the sunrise, so we packed accordingly. We walked about 5 minutes down this path, which opened up into a massive beach. We set up camp, which consisted of beach chairs, a speaker, and 2 coolers, one filled with ice for fish and one filled with snacks, water, and beers. Asher brought these massive fishing rods that were ideal for beach fishing and also rod holders that you would hammer into the sand. He also had these little bells that connect to the tip of the rod to notify you of any movement. We all cast our rods, cracked a couple of beers, and played the waiting game. Within 2 hours, each of us had caught decent-sized fish, which definitely lightened our spirits. We were having a great time, music blasting, knowing that no one was around on this deserted beach. Mid-conversation, Victor stopped talking, lowered the music, and jolted his head to the left. He asked if we heard that, to which we replied, "Heard what?" It looked like he was concentrating on something for a second and then said, "I heard someone yell something." We obviously thought he was hearing things or just joking with us, but he insisted he heard someone yell out something that sounded like a "yo" or a "hey." Either way, it seemed unlikely given that we were on some hidden beach at like 1 a.m., so he quickly forgot about it and our conversation resumed. It definitely made us more aware, though. A couple of minutes later, right after I cast in a fresh hook, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. There was something on the beach in the distance, but I couldn't see what exactly. The others noticed it too. As it got closer, we realized what it was, a person walking towards us. We grew silent and turned off the music. He came up to us. It was a middle-aged white man, maybe 40 or 50. He was wearing a dark blue jacket with a hat and hood up. The way he walked up to us was really sketchy, and he had this intimidating look on his face. We said, "What's up?" kind of awkwardly. He just eyed us down for like 10 seconds and then said in a low voice, "What are you boys up to?" It was pretty apparent what we were up to. Asher said, "We're fishing," and he let out some grunt of acknowledgement and nodded his head. He didn't say a word after that and just stood there, looking at us, then at the rods, and then at the water. We shot each other looks, thinking he was going to try and rob us. There was no way he could have taken on the three of us, though. The bell on one of our rods broke the silence, notifying us that we had potentially hooked a fish. I said, "We got one," kind of directed at everyone, but mostly at that weird guy in hopes that I would get some response out of him like a normal person. I walked over to the rods and reeled in a small striper. When I went back to unhook the fish, that man had turned around and left. We watched as his dark silhouette faded away into the night. We made sure that we had all of our belongings, then sat and just talked about how odd that encounter was. He left without harming us, though, so we concluded that he was just some weird man who was now, thankfully, out of our business. We kept the music off just to be cautious and cracked a few more beers as our conversation transitioned to different topics. At one point, while staring into the horizon, I thought I heard something in the distance. It took me a second to realize what it was, but when I did, my heart dropped. It was a car alarm. I knew it was mine. It was the only car in that lot, and there were no houses out there for probably miles. We started panicking and decided to run back to the car, leaving all of our stuff behind. It took us a couple of minutes to get there, and when we did, I was completely distraught. My tires had been slashed, and my driver's side window had been shattered. I got on my phone with the police immediately and told them my location and situation. The operator asked if I knew who may have done it, and we said some sketchy guy came up to us as we were fishing. She asked if I knew where he went, and I said no. Just as I said this, we heard rustling in the woods around us. My heart rose into my throat. I felt trapped. We frantically ran like 200 yards down the road and hid in the trees. I told the operator this, and she said to stay hidden and keep quiet. Within 10 minutes, we saw 2 cop cars speed up with their lights on. We ran back to the car and saw 3 officers searching the area. Multiple things had been stolen, including my wallet, some cash that was in the glove box, and the remainder of Asher's fishing gear. They found a large knife lying on the ground nearby, which they took for fingerprints and evidence. I told them the whole story, with my adrenaline still pumping. They said we were smart to run away and hide, as it's very likely this man meant us harm. Those words made me appreciate my life so much more. The officers made us feel safe and were nice enough to help us pack up the equipment and carry it back. They took down our information and gave us a ride back to the house. We stayed up all night reflecting on what had just happened. That morning, Victor got us a ride up north, and I picked up my car from the shop a few days later. To this day, this is by far the most frightening experience I've ever had. What was supposed to be a normal fishing trip became a terrifying ordeal that cost me hundreds of dollars worth of damages. I never got a call back from the police, meaning that guy is probably still out there. Needless to say, I gave up fishing as a hobby and haven't touched it since. In the heart of the dense forest stood a lake, its waters dark and foreboding, shrouded in mystery and fear. Local legends whispered of a curse upon the lake, warning fishermen and adventurers alike to stay far away. But curiosity, as it often does, beckoned the bold to its shores. Among those drawn to the lake was Andrew, a seasoned angler with a thirst for adventure that overshadowed any superstition. Armed with his fishing gear and determination, he ventured into the woods, guided by stories of monstrous catches and whispered horrors. As he reached the edge of the lake, an eerie mist rose from its surface, obscuring what lay beneath. Ignoring the chill that crept up his spine, Andrew cast his line into the murky depths, eager to test his skills against whatever lurked below. Hours passed with little success, and the sun began to sink below the horizon, casting long shadows across the water. Just as Andrew prepared to call it a day, his line suddenly went taut, pulling him forward with unexpected force. With a grunt of surprise, he struggled to reel in his catch, the water churning and bubbling as whatever he had hooked fought against him. Heart pounding, Andrew finally managed to haul his prize onto the shore, only to stagger back in horror at what lay before him. It was no fish that writhed and thrashed at his feet, but a grotesque abomination straight from the nightmares of ancient lore. Its twisted form was a grotesque amalgamation of scales and tentacles, its eyes burning with a malevolent intelligence that sent shivers down Andrew's spine. In a panic, he stumbled backward, tripping over his own feet as he scrambled to escape the creature's grasp. But it was too late. The creature lunged forward with lightning speed, its tentacles wrapping around Andrew's legs and dragging him screaming into the depths below. Far from civilization, nestled deep within a remote valley, flowed a river teeming with life and death in equal measure. It was said that the spirits of those who had perished in its unforgiving currents still haunted its banks, seeking vengeance on the living who dared to trespass upon their domain. Among the bravest, or perhaps the most foolish, was Nadia, a thrill-seeker with a penchant for danger that bordered on obsession. Determined to test her mettle against the river's legendary inhabitants, she embarked on a solo kayaking expedition, heedless of the warnings that echoed in her ears. As she navigated the treacherous rapids, Nadia felt a chill wind sweep down from the mountains, carrying with it whispers of the past and the promise of doom. Ignoring the sense of unease that gnawed at her insides, she pressed on, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and excitement. But as she rounded a bend in the river, she was greeted by a sight that froze the blood in her veins. A spectral figure, pale and ethereal, drifted silently upon the water's surface, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly light, fixated upon Nadia with a hunger that sent shivers down her spine. Paralyzed with terror, she watched as the figure drew nearer, its form twisting and contorting with each passing moment. And then, with a sudden burst of speed, it lunged forward, its icy fingers closing around Nadia's throat with a grip that stole the very breath from her lungs. Gasping for air, she fought against the spectral assailant, her paddle swinging wildly as she struggled to break free. But the spirit's grasp was unyielding, its grip tightening with each passing second until Nadia could feel her consciousness slipping away. Just when all seemed lost, a blinding light pierced the darkness, driving back the specter with a force that sent it shrieking into the night. Blinking away tears of relief, Nadia found herself face to face with a figure bathed in radiant light, a guardian spirit come to her aid in her hour of need. With a gentle touch, the spirit guided Nadia to safety, its presence warding off the malevolent forces that lurked within the river's depths. And as she emerged from the water, shaken but alive, she knew that she would never again tempt fate in the haunted waters that lay beyond. Out upon the open sea, where the horizon stretches on forever and the depths conceal untold secrets, sailed the trawler-cursed Endeavor, a vessel steeped in legend and whispered tales of woe. For generations, it had plied the waters in search of riches untold, its crew bound by a dark pact that none dared to break. Among those who called the cursed trawler home was Captain Drake, a weathered seafarer with a haunted look in his eyes and a past shrouded in mystery. For years, he had served as master of the ship, guiding her through storms and tempests with a skill that bordered on the supernatural. But as the years wore on, the crew began to whisper of strange happenings aboard the trawler, whispers of voices in the night, of shadows that moved of their own accord, and of a curse that had followed them across the seven seas. Undeterred by such tales, Captain Drake pressed on, determined to uncover the truth behind the curse that plagued his ship. But with each passing day, the supernatural occurrences grew more frequent and more terrifying, until even the bravest among them trembled at the thought of what lurked in the darkness below. It was on a moonless night, with the wind howling and the waves crashing against the hull, that the curse finally revealed its true form. As the crew gathered on deck, their faces pale with fear, a monstrous shape rose from the depths, its eyes burning with a hatred that chilled the soul. With a deafening roar, the creature lashed out, its tentacles snaking across the deck with deadly precision. Panic ensued as the crew fought for their lives, their screams lost in the fury of the storm that raged around them. But amidst the chaos, Captain Drake stood firm, his eyes blazing with a determination born of desperation. With a mighty roar, he rallied his crew, leading them in a final desperate assault against the creature that threatened to drag them all to a watery grave. And as dawn broke over the horizon, the cursed trawler sailed on, battered but unbroken, its crew united in their victory over the darkness that had sought to claim them. For though the curse may linger still, they knew that as long as they stood together, they would never again fear the horrors that lurked beneath the waves. It was December 31st, New Year's Eve. My friend Harry hired me to watch his dog, Bailey, for the weekend while he was out of town for the new year. I'm 34, he's 26, so I don't have that same urge to go out and party for New Year's Eve like he does. I was more okay with making some money and taking it easy for the night. New Year's Eve was on a Saturday. He left for the city early in the day. When I got there, he'd be back Sunday night. He left me with very basic instructions: just feed him and walk him twice a day, and keep him off the furniture. Bailey is a very small husky mix. I'm not sure what else she is, but she's about a third the size of a regular husky, and she's very quiet and well behaved. Hence why Harry was okay with me watching her instead of a dog sitter. I brought a backpack which contained my laptop, charger, toiletries, and a change of clothes for Sunday. Harry and I don't go way back. We met through mutual friends and had started going out occasionally on the weekends ever since. I would be sleeping in the spare bedroom of his house on the futon. Throughout the day, I just did stuff on my laptop and played some of Harry's video games. Later in the night, I invited my girl over with Harry's permission. His response was, "You better not in my bed," a way of jokingly saying yes, she can come over. She said she'd be getting out of work after 12, but then she'd come straight over. Harry's house is about half an hour from us, so my girl Ratty wouldn't be getting there until late. I had to kill the time alone with Bailey, watching movies until then. We were in the living room, and Bailey was by my feet. It was probably 9 p.m. when the doorbell rang. I went to answer the door, and it was a girl at the door. She looked about 30. She had a hoodie on and was holding a jacket. She introduced herself as Harry's girlfriend and said she left something here that she needed to grab. I offered to grab it if she wanted, and she said no, it's okay, she knew where it was in his room. I said okay, that's fine, and let her inside. She went straight upstairs to Harry's room and slightly closed the door behind her without latching it. I right away texted Harry, "I didn't know you had a girlfriend." She was in there for quite some time until she came back out, still holding her jacket. She came back down the stairs, thanked me, and was going straight for the door. I tried to stop her for a quick conversation, saying, "How long have you guys been dating?" And she said, "Too long," then laughed as if making a joke. I laughed too, and then she said, "Have a good night." I was a bit surprised by the interaction, but what I gathered from it was they had probably just recently broken up. Now I started to worry that maybe I shouldn't have let her in since Harry hadn't answered my text yet. I called him a few times before he picked up. He was out with his friends in a loud setting, so he could hardly hear me until he went outside to talk. I told him his girlfriend just came by to grab something, and he was completely bewildered at what I was saying. "Who are you talking about?" he said. I responded, "She said she was your girlfriend. I didn't get a name." He said in a yell, "You know I don't have a girlfriend." "What did she look like?" I started to feel really stupid just about now. I described the girl, and he said he had no idea who this could have been. I then proceeded to explain to him that she went upstairs to his room for a few minutes, then came back down. This was when he started freaking out. He told me to go up to his room now and check if she stole anything. Of course, I didn't know what was in his room beforehand, so he had me check for specific things, which all appeared to still be there. He tried hard to figure out who it could have been and said he'd call me back after he made some calls and sent me some pictures of different girls. Understandably, this was putting a damper on his night. I could tell he'd already been drinking, so I felt awfully stupid for letting some random girl into the house. He started sending me screenshots of different girls' Instagram accounts. None of them resembled the girl who came in. When I said no to all of them, he went silent for an hour. Then he texted me randomly, "I think I know who it was. Make sure she doesn't come back." I didn't ask any further questions. I responded, "Okay, my bad," and left it at that. Clearly, Harry was going through some serious girl drama, or so I thought. I watched the ball drop alone, not that I really cared about the new year or the ball drop at all. Later that night, Radif finally made it over, and so we hung out in the living room together. I told her what happened, and she was shocked. But then a freakish coincidence happened. Bailey lifted her head and looked at the front door, and then there was a knocking at the door. Whoever it was didn't ring the bell. There was no shot I was opening it. I called Harry a bunch of times, but he didn't pick up. He was wasted and didn't even feel his phone vibrating. Ratty and I stayed quiet, and eventually, whoever it was went away. I was honestly unnerved now. Surely it was in connection to whoever that girl was earlier. Maybe it was even her again. Either way, I didn't want to get involved any further in what was going on. After this, we decided to migrate to the spare bedroom where we'd stay for the night on the futon. We had a movie on as we lay down, and I held her. We fell asleep in this position and woke up at some unknown hour in the night, which I later found out was less than an hour after we fell asleep. I woke to Bailey's howling. She was in the room with us. Ratty woke up after me. Bailey was at the bedroom door, with her tail wagging, howling. I whispered, "Bailey, shush." She looked at me and then came over, but she stayed staring at the door, now growling, making unhappy whimpering sounds. Then there were footsteps outside on the wood floors. We heard what had to be at least 2 pairs of footsteps tiptoeing to the door, and then the doorknob twisted. By force of habit, we had the door locked, thankfully, and a girl's voice said, "Harry." I looked at Ratty and signaled for her to stay quiet. That girl was not alone. Another light tap at the door, and then the girl's voice said, "Who's in there? This is Harry's house." I made the decision to say in a loud voice, almost a yell, "The cops have been on their way for a few minutes now, just so you know." The girl said, "Who are you?" I didn't bite. I whispered to Ratty to actually call the police, and she did. The entire time she whispered into the phone. I said loud and clear, "I dare you to do something, because by the time you do it, the cops will be running through the front door." I heard a whisper on the other side of the door, then multiple pairs of footsteps walking away from the door. We stayed in the room waiting for the cops to get there. Since the front door was left wide open by those people, the cops came right in. The house was clear by this point. I gave my entire recount of the story and then called Harry multiple times until he finally picked up, still sounding pretty drunk. One cop talked with him on the phone for a few minutes while I sat with Ratty speaking with another cop. After all this was said and done, the accepted assumption was that there was a key in Harry's room taken by that girl from hours before. This was a pretty messy situation since Harry couldn't just come all the way home this late. He practically begged me to stay the rest of the night. I had rather go home. I stayed because I felt responsible for letting that girl in the first place. I stayed locked in that room the rest of the night with Bailey. I literally wedged a chair against the front door, some half-ass attempt at keeping them out if they decided to return. By morning, though, it seemed that they didn't return. Harry came back earlier that day than originally planned. I'm not going to air out any more private information to the internet than I already have, just in case anyone who knows him can figure out this story is about him. But he did tell me who he thought the girl was, and the story behind it proves that men have to be careful too with the women they choose to interact with. That girl and whoever was with her's intention of breaking in wasn't to steal anything evidently, which is the scariest part. He changed his locks ASAP. I can't even imagine staying in that house if I were him after this. However, it's been a year and as far as I know, nothing has happened unless he's keeping more to the story he told me a secret. After returning from a night to celebrate the arrival of the new year, my husband and I returned to our apartment complex to turn in for the night. We both had a couple of drinks, but neither of us were intoxicated. As much as we enjoy partying with friends, when it comes down to it, we are really just homebodies. We lived in the corner penthouse suite of our complex. Although this was never confirmed, it was suspected the owners wanted to convert this apartment complex into condos. The rent certainly was not cheap, and access was limited to this floor. Upon entering the building, there is a walk-up to secure doors, and every now and then there would be a doorman to greet you as you entered or exited. There were also multiple security cameras placed throughout and around the building. It was an especially cold evening, and when we returned, there was no doorman present. It was late, at least 2:30 a.m. The foyer was empty, and one of the lights flickered softly. My husband and I entered the elevator and pressed the button to the top floor. The elevator ride was smooth, and as we ascended, I could feel myself becoming more relaxed, excited to finally be home and able to rest. My feet were killing me from wearing heels all night in the bitter cold. The bell chimed, signaling we had reached our floor. The door slid open, and we turned the corner to the left. Like I said, our suite was the corner suite at the end of the hall. However, something caught our eye. A woman, or what at least looked like a woman, was meandering through the hallway. Her hair was dark and scattered, it looked to be matted and covered her face. She wore a black lace dress that was torn and looked to be in bad shape. Thinking back, I don't even think she had any footwear on. We assumed she was intoxicated and was having difficulty finding her suite. Although on closer inspection, she didn't look familiar. We knew all of our neighbors, as, like I said, access was limited on this floor. I looked at my husband, who stood still as well. I could see he was contemplating the same thoughts. I asked him, should we ask if she needs help? He looked at me and said, just wait, maybe she's just drunk and having a hard time finding her suite. The woman just continued to slowly slide herself along the walls of the hallway, stopping at each door and peering through the exterior peepholes. Admittedly, this was creepy, but it just added to the theory that she was a drunk woman looking for her friends. She was humming, or what I believe was humming. The sound was something between a growl and a hum. We stood there in utter disbelief and awe. However, there was a veil of tension and uneasiness that lingered. The strange woman stumbled through the hallway, hunched over, until she pulled herself up to peer through the peephole. She eventually got to a suite of an elderly lady, whom I have a strong connection with. We'll just call her Evelyn. Evelyn was the sort of woman whose family had neglected her and rarely visited. She would bring my husband and me baked goods from time to time. I would bring her leftovers and assist her with groceries and medication. Frequently, Evelyn's smoke alarm would constantly go off. I would have to rush over and pull out the smoldering toast from her toaster and fan her smoke alarm until it stopped beeping. At times, a nuisance, but it would always turn into tea time. Nevertheless, I cared about Evelyn. So when I saw this strange woman peer into her peephole, I reacted. I blurted out, "Excuse me, are you all right?" I could feel myself lose confidence as I asked. The strange woman seemed to shudder for a moment and hunched over to the floor. She looked like she was about to puke or was frightened by my voice. My husband and I stepped closer, but the woman then let out a series of soft and menacing laughs, just barely audible. I have to admit, in this moment I was thoroughly creeped out and reached for my cell phone. It was uncomfortable because we couldn't get to our suite. Without having to walk right past this deranged woman, my husband said, "Hey, did you hear us? Do you need help?" Her laugh began to grow into what was a steady cackle. The strange woman then stood up. As she stood up, her cackle became a mixture between a cackle and a boisterous growl. She then stumbled forward and continued walking down the hall. There was a staircase just outside of our suite. I assumed she was making her way to the stairs, just too embarrassed to walk past us to the elevator. Maybe she was just a drunk woman, and this was nothing more than an uncomfortable standoff with a sad and intoxicated woman. I mean, if she was really that drunk, the stairs probably weren't a good idea. We were on the 7th floor. Nevertheless, I just didn't feel like it was worth the risk to engage with this woman. I just wanted to enter my suite and dive into bed. It was late, and my feet still hurt. As we took a few steps forward, the woman stopped, almost with laser precision. She stood up completely straight, looked right at our door, and then began to pound on our door, screaming bloody murder. I could feel myself becoming swallowed with fear. I reached for my cell phone and began to dial 911. The woman kept pounding on our door and screaming. To be honest, I'm surprised none of our neighbors came out to see what was happening. Part of me thinks they were too afraid themselves and were probably peering out of their peepholes. Afraid of what our neighbors would think, my husband said, "Hey, what are you doing? Stop that." And just like that, the strange woman stopped, fell to the ground, and began crawling quickly towards us. She looked up for a brief second. All I could see were her dark eyes. Her mouth seemed to be stained black, and she was growling again, but this time it was as if there was something in her throat that she was choking on. Frozen with fear, my husband and I just watched until she flashed us a menacing hiss, the kind you would hear in a movie but never imagined in real life. Terrified, I whipped off my shoes, and my husband and I ran towards the staircase on the other side of the building. We didn't want to risk waiting for the elevator and have her catching up. We went down 2 flights of stairs and stopped to listen if she was making her way down the stairs, but it was almost impossible to hear as my heart was pounding so hard. I thought to myself, what the hell was going on? We waited there for 10 minutes or so until eventually, we had the courage to head up the stairs and back to our suite. The woman was gone, and so we entered our suite. I was just relieved to finally be safe in my home. My husband sent a text to our landlord, and he replied that we would hear from him in the morning. I was so unbelievably exhausted but found it incredibly difficult to sleep. The sound of that woman's growling and cackling rang in my ears. I hardly slept. The next day, when my husband went to speak to the landlord, he asked him to check the security cameras. Although nothing turned up, the landlord said the cameras glitched due to the frigid temperatures last night. To this day, I still don't know what to think. That woman most certainly had problems. The question is, was she dangerous? We moved about a year later, but every New Year's Eve, I still think about that night. It was New Year's Eve of 2020, and all of us were ready for this horrible year to be over. My friend Michael was throwing a house party. I arrived early to help set things up. I secured a spot to sleep in his parents' room, meaning I could drive to the party and drink without having to worry about driving home. His parents obviously weren't home for the night. Most of our close friends in our friend group came, plus a bunch of Michael's friends who I didn't know. The party was fun. At midnight, everyone screamed "Happy New Year" and cheered their drinks. After that, people slowly started circulating out, and the party started to quiet down as people went to either other parties, bars, or home. The later the night got, the more it became just the closer friends staying behind, until it just turned into a chill drinking session in the living room. This went on late into the night. It was likely 2:40 a.m. when the last of everyone who wasn't sleeping at Michael's house was gone. As it quieted down, we started hearing this occasional sound. At first, we didn't know what it was, but it soon started to sound like a creaking sound. It was dismissed as a sound from the fridge or something at first, which I know sounds stupid, but house appliances often make weird noises. It was just Michael, me, and Lloyd. Lloyd was falling asleep on the couch already. It was reaching that time where we were just going to go to sleep. However, eventually, we got so bothered by the noise that we had to search. We went to the kitchen, and it wasn't coming from in there. We realized when we were close to the basement door that it was coming from downstairs. Michael opened the door, and we heard this creaking sound. "Go check what it is," I said. He kept saying, "No way." Then he called down into the basement, "Yo, who's down there?" The creaking stopped, and we never heard it again. After a solid minute of waiting at the top of the stairs, we agreed to go down together. We both grabbed knives, drunkenly thinking that was a good idea, when in reality, we were so drunk we'd probably only hurt ourselves with them. We got to the bottom of the stairs and looked through the entire basement. It's not huge, it just has a couch, TV, a bar, a table in a corner, and various old pieces of junk. It was pretty messy at the time. The first thing we did was search any possible crevice for someone who could be hiding. Then we tried to figure out what could have been making that sound. I noticed a rocking chair, and so I went up to it, sat in it, and then started rocking in it. It made the exact same creaking sound we had been hearing. Michael and I looked at each other. I stood up, and so did every hair on my body. I don't think we ever ran faster than we did when we ran up those stairs and slammed the door shut. We tried to come up with any logical explanation, but there was none. He kept the basement door locked for days until his parents came back. There was no living soul down there, but something was moving that rocking chair. That rocking chair used to belong to his grandma, who passed away forever ago, and it's just something his mom held on to for sentimental reasons. I can't say I've ever experienced anything resembling the paranormal before this, nor since then. It still sends chills down my spine. A couple of years ago, when I was in college, I went to a New Year's Eve party. For a little bit of background, I'm a female and lived on campus but went home for winter break. My parents' house was only about an hour away from campus, and I had a few friends who went back to school early. There was going to be a New Year's Eve party at one of my best friend's houses on campus, so I went back there for it. First, I went back to my college apartment and then arrived at my friend's on New Year's Eve at about 5 p.m. I was one of the first people there, and we just kind of hung out until the other people came over. For a long time, it was a lot of fun, and a lot of my college friends were there, but like many college parties that I went to, things soon became a little bit out of control. A lot more people started to show up at like 10 p.m. or so. The college that I went to is a very large university. I'm not sure how many people attended, but probably well over 25,000 or 30,000. The house soon had a lot of people that I didn't even recognize in it. I was still having a good time, though, until this one guy came up to me. He was a man who looked to be in his 29-year-old and had a tall, somewhat muscular build. Now, he wasn't jacked or anything, but he also wasn't fat, he was just big. He came right up to me, seeming drunk, and started asking me questions about myself. We talked, but not long into the conversation, he asked if I wanted to leave with him. I said no. He kept asking, and I soon walked away. It was very crowded, and the guy followed me all around just about wherever I went. By that point, it was probably midnight, and I decided to just leave. I walked through the crowd of people and found my friends. I told one of them about the guy who was following me, and then I said I would be leaving. I tried to point him out in the crowd, but at that point, I couldn't find him. Then I said bye to my friend, and I left. When I first got outside, I thought that the guy had finally given up. I didn't see him, and I was walking back to my apartment, which was only a few blocks away. But when I started to walk down the street, I heard somebody leaving the house and turned around to see the guy. He yelled at me, asking me where I was going. I told him that I was going home, and he started to walk towards me. Now I was concerned that he was going to follow me all the way back to my apartment. I tried to just ignore him and walk away and hope that he would stop, but he didn't. I heard him walking down the street after me, trying to catch up. I walked as fast as I could without running. When I made it to where I had to turn, he was still behind me. He was a long way back, so I tried to lose him. I cut through a random person's yard and then went through their backyard. Once I got through there, I cut into the next block over and then walked the other way down the street. This ended up working, and when I got off of that street, I no longer saw him. I was able to make it back to my apartment, and I even checked outside when I got back to make sure that he didn't somehow follow me. Everything was fine, and I went to bed shortly after. The next day, I went back to my parents' house because classes didn't start for college for about 2 more weeks. After driving back home, I arrived sometime in the early afternoon. It was then that I saw I was added on Snapchat by someone. It was a guy named Basil. I didn't automatically assume that it was the same guy from the night before. My college was so big, and I knew a lot of people and didn't have all their snaps. To be honest, I got added by people on almost a daily basis, plus I didn't even recall this guy telling me his name the night before. But after the guy added me on Snapchat, he said hi to me, and I asked him who he was. He responded, saying we met last night, remember? That's when I realized it was the same person. Still, I asked him to clarify. He said he was at the party and then described himself. When he did, I blocked him. I wanted nothing to do with this guy because, after all, he had tried to follow me home. After that, he did not contact me, but the story doesn't end there. That night, I was at my parents' house in my bedroom. I noticed out of my window a car parked on the side of the road out front. It was kind of weird because our neighborhood was quiet and everybody's houses had long driveways with plenty of space to park. Plus, the car was parked like 20 feet from our driveway. It was a very typical looking sedan, but I couldn't see if anybody was inside or not because it was too far away. I decided to get up and walk over to the window to get a little bit better view. When I did, literally right when I got to the window, I saw the driver's door open. A man got out, and at first, I had no clue who it was. But then the guy came into our driveway and walked along the side of it. When he got a little bit closer, I realized it was the same guy. This really blew my mind. At first, I was not even near campus. I was at my parents' house an hour away. Why was he here? I watched him walk all the way up the driveway, but he didn't go into the front yard. Instead, he went around the side of the house and out of my view. It seemed as though he was going into the back. I hurried out of my room and found my parents. I told them about the guy, and then I called the police. We carefully went to a window in the back of the house and looked out to try to see the guy. It was really dark back there with many opportunities for places for him to hide. We didn't see him, but we knew that he was back there somewhere. For the next few minutes, he remained hidden. Then the police arrived. They came to the front door, and we let them know that the guy was probably hiding in the backyard. Our property was searched, and the man was located. He tried to run away, but was caught before making it off of our property. It turned out that the guy didn't even go to my college. He had found my location through the brief time that he had me on Snapchat because my location was on. This is an experience that is still almost unbelievable to me to this day. I feel lucky that I noticed the car and saw the man get out. If I didn't, I would not have known that it was his car or that he was hiding in the backyard. What he planned to do, I'm not sure, but I'm glad that we called the police. Each year when I was a kid, we would celebrate New Year's Eve and stay up late. Normally, I would go to bed at about 10 o'clock, but on New Year's Eve, I would stay up until around 2 a.m. My sister, my parents, and I would play board games and watch movies. We would then watch the ball drop when it was midnight and would stay up for several more hours. I think this happened when I was about 12 years old. That time, like any other, we played games and watched a couple of movies. This continued well past midnight, and at roughly 2 a.m., we all got tired and finally decided to go to bed. We could sleep in the next day because nobody had work or school. Our house was on a pretty quiet street. Other than that, it was a pretty typical neighborhood. I stayed up a little bit later than everybody else that night because I was watching a movie in the living room. When it ended, I finally went to bed. I remember getting back into my bedroom and turning out the lights. When I did, I could see very clearly into the front yard because of the moonlight. There was a woman standing in our yard. She was not facing me, and I didn't recognize her. I walked over to the window, and when I did, the woman turned and faced me. She saw me and then started to walk closer in my direction. This really creeped me out. Nobody was supposed to be in our front yard. Nothing like this had ever happened before. I moved away from the window and hid. I ducked down and laid on the floor so that she couldn't see me. My window was pretty large, and I did not have a cover on it at the time. Now, my bedroom was also on the second floor, so she couldn't directly reach me, but I was still terrified. I waited there, just hoping that she would go away. A few minutes went by, then I heard something hit my window. I wasn't sure as to what it was. I started watching my window, and something else hit it. The woman was throwing sticks at it. She was trying to get my attention, and I don't know why, but I got up. I carefully looked out of the window again. The woman was still there and looking right up at me, this time closer. She said something, but I couldn't hear her. Then I saw her motioning for me to let her inside. I was not going to do that. She then walked to the side of the yard near the front door. Then she knocked on the front door. I didn't move. I was hoping that my parents or sister would wake up. I didn't have the thought to call the police for some reason. It just never entered my mind. The woman knocked on the door on and off for like 5 minutes. Finally, she walked away. I watched her from the window walk to the end of the driveway and then a little ways down. She then got inside of a vehicle and drove off. The whole situation was really bizarre, and it really confused me. The next morning, I told my parents about it. They had no idea what she could have been doing either. Luckily though, she never came back. This happened just last year. It was New Year's Eve, and my wife and I were having friends over to our house. There were about 15 other people coming over, and we were going to have somewhat of a party. After everybody arrived, we had some food, and I talked with everyone. We played some games as well. My wife and I have a house that has about a 2-acre yard and is somewhat out in the country. At 12 o'clock, we all went outside and into the backyard behind the house to open champagne. Obviously, we didn't want to open it inside and have it spray all over the furniture, plus it wasn't that cold out. We stayed outside in the backyard for maybe a total of 10 minutes, then everybody went back in. All of our friends stayed until roughly 1 a.m. and then started leaving. By 1:30, everyone was gone. My wife and I cleaned up a bit and were very tired. I remember that my wife went upstairs to our bedroom, and I was finishing up loading the dishwasher downstairs in the kitchen. After I did so, I started to walk away, and I heard what I thought was my wife walking down the hallway. The hallway was out of my sight. It was kind of near the stairs, and I was around the corner from it. I called out my wife's name, wondering why she'd come back down, but she didn't answer me. I remember that I walked over there, which took me maybe 10 seconds. When I got there, I saw nothing. I was sort of confused, but I figured that my wife hadn't heard me calling for her and she just went back upstairs. I went upstairs and then got ready for bed. I didn't bother to ask her if she had just been downstairs or anything. So after I got ready, I turned out the lights and got in bed. Everything became silent, and that's when my wife asked me if I heard that. I hadn't heard anything. I sat up and asked her what she had heard, and she told me that it sounded like somebody was walking around downstairs. I listened closely, and then I sort of heard it. I walked over to the doorway and opened it up very quietly. Now I could hear much better, and somebody was definitely down there. They must have been who I had heard earlier. It really creeped me out, but then I heard the footsteps starting to walk up the stairs. I quickly closed the door back up and locked it. My wife already had her phone and was dialing 911. We then went into the bathroom connected to our bedroom, which also had a locking door on it. This would give us a little bit of extra space and safety. We were told that the police would be there within 10 minutes. As we were inside of the bathroom, we didn't really hear much. We were both trying to figure out who the person in the house was and how they had gotten in. Then out of nowhere, I heard somebody banging on our bedroom door. I did my best to try to ignore it. Hopefully, whoever was there would not be able to break through. This went on for quite some time though. At one point, it stopped, but then it picked back up again several minutes later. Finally, at last, the police arrived. When they did, they entered the house, and I heard them yelling from downstairs. I really couldn't hear what they were saying though. We did not leave the bathroom because it wasn't safe to come out yet. We heard yelling on and off for the next 10 minutes. Finally, we heard police officers' voices, and we were told that it was safe. The person inside of our house was a man who we didn't know. He was caught and had snuck into the house after we all went outside. Then he hid until we were going to go to bed. When the police got there, he threatened them and claimed to have a weapon, even though he didn't. Eventually, they were able to get him to come downstairs. I think the guy was on drugs or something. He did mess up our house a little bit, but I'm glad that everyone was okay. I still can't believe that while our friends and us were inside, the guy was hiding in our house somewhere. That was the craziest New Year's Eve ever. When I was 12, the dawning of a new millennium took place on New Year's Eve. While people were fearing the worst with the Y2K bug or out partying and drinking, I was home alone. In 1996, my parents had split up and from there, they divorced. My mother and I moved across the country from Oregon to Tennessee with her best friend. On the eve of the year 2000, I was home alone and my mother was currently out of state. Now, this didn't worry me as this was not the first time. I often came home to find a note on the kitchen counter saying that they had gone to Florida for a few days and that there were groceries in the fridge. Since the divorce, she was habitually leaving me alone for long periods of time to go to Florida. We lived on a relatively quiet road surrounded by trees and set a few miles out of town. I knew most of the people, if not by name then by face, enough to wave and have a small chat with. I had never been given a reason to be afraid of being alone. On the night in question, I was staying up late watching television. I remember I was watching the movie His Bodyguard on the USA channel, and I had most of the lights on in the house. Not because I was afraid, but because at 12, I wasn't concerned with the electricity bills or even saving the environment. I felt completely safe and protected within my little bubble of home. As I was watching the movie, I kept hearing these weird sounds outside, but I remember thinking it was probably the neighbors. Though they weren't extremely close, a couple of them were having a party or people over for the holiday. About halfway into the movie, however, the power in the house suddenly went dead. I sat on the couch for a minute, just sort of in a panic daze because it was near midnight and pitch black. I remember thinking the power must have gone out and that it would come back on, so I just decided to sit on the couch with my blanket and wait. A few minutes passed by when I heard a noise in the kitchen where the back door is. My heart started racing in my chest because I thought it sounded like the back door being shut. The back door sits just off of the dining room, which is connected to the kitchen and leads directly into the living room where I was currently sitting on the couch. A few seconds passed after I heard the sound, and I was straining my ears to pick up anything that wasn't supposed to be there. Every noise suddenly felt magnified. When footsteps sounded on the floor, I immediately slithered off of the couch onto all fours, crawled around the ottoman, and started, as slowly and as quietly as I could, to make my way toward the space between the love seat and the couch. I knew I could fit under the side table and be completely hidden by the dark and the ottoman from playing hide and seek in the dark many times with my friends during sleepovers. I was nearly there when the footsteps became more apparent. I knew from the sound of them that whoever it was making their way through the kitchen now toward the living room. They weren't hurried or anything, it was just like they were moving around in the kitchen. I glanced up from where I was crouched on the floor, and to my horror, there was a dark silhouette standing in the doorway between the two rooms. To my credit, I didn't scream, however, I did panic. I stood immediately to my feet from my hiding spot and I ran down the hallway. I believe the only reason I wasn't grabbed by now is because the person chasing me had to get around the ottoman in the dark to follow me. I did what all children would do when they're afraid. I bypassed the front door, the guest bedroom, the bathroom, and I ran to the farthest door down the hallway, my room. In all honesty, I probably wouldn't have been able to get the front door unlocked and open in time as it was right off the side of the couch. As I ran into the room, I slammed the door shut and locked it. However, the lock was simply one of those little turn knobs that you can easily pop with a butter knife. I had barely gotten the door shut and locked and the person on the other side knocked on it. I have no idea why they knocked, if they did it to mock me or to scare me, but I knew in my heart that my little lock was not going to keep whoever it was on the other side out of my room. It didn't keep my mother out when we were arguing, and it certainly wouldn't stand up to brute force. I was panicking and on the verge of tears when the person started laughing. That after he had stopped, though being under my bed gave me no feelings of being secure. I didn't come out from under it because I simply had nowhere else to go. I thought about trying to go out the window, but I was afraid he might expect it and therefore be waiting for me on the other side. It was also several feet off the ground as the house was built on a raised foundation. I remember laying under my bed, terrified, for what felt like hours. At some point, I must have fallen asleep because I awoke the next morning to daylight. The fear of what had happened came back to me as soon as I registered where I was and why. Scared that whoever had been in my house might still be there, I decided to crawl out the window and run to a neighbor since it was daylight outside and therefore I felt less afraid. Crawling out this kind of window was a lot harder than it looks, and I did it less than gracefully as I was not, and still am not, the most coordinated person. Once I was back on my feet, however, I carefully made my way around the house. That's when I noticed that the back door was wide open. Scared but feeling braver now that I was outside and that it was morning instead of pitch black night, I walked back up the steps and started peering inside. Seeing nothing out of the ordinary, meaning no terrifying man leering at me basically, I decided to go inside. Looking back, I cringe at how stupid this could have turned out, and I wish I would have told my younger self to make the smarter move and just go get help. But thankfully, no one was inside the house. I did a terrifying, heart-pounding room-to-room check, looking in closets and under beds, behind the couch, and anywhere I thought even a small child might be able to fit. I even popped the lock on my mom's bedroom so I could check it, and then relocked it afterward. When I was positive there was no one there, I went back to lock the back door. I had left it open in case I needed to escape, and I noticed that the breaker box on the opposite wall was open. The main switch had been pulled. I flipped it back on, locked both locks on the back door, and checked all the windows and front door. Then I called my mom, where I once again broke down crying hysterically. She called a coworker, who came and stayed the entire day with me as they drove back. My mom still took random trips to Florida after that, but I always went with her from then on. This past New Year's Eve, I went away for the night with my two best friends and one of their moms. I was home for the holidays from college, and my friend Yarezi invited me to go to Palm Springs to celebrate New Year's with her mom and our friend Nadia. I didn't have any other plans, so I decided to go with them. We went to a cool city about an hour from where we live that is big on shopping and resorts. We planned to have a pretty calm night, watch the ball drop at a block party downtown, and have a few drinks at the bar. Since we're on the West Coast, the ball drop is at 9:30, so at around 8:30, we ventured from our hotel, walking to the block party about a mile away. On the way, we passed by a very lively bar. We decided to stop by and we spent 15 minutes dancing, but we didn't get any drinks. It was a gay bar, and Yarezi and Nadia, being gay, were stoked on it and wanted to come back after the ball drop, even though it was about 90% men there. We continued on to the block party to get some dinner and a glass of champagne. The ball finally dropped and they had a DJ, so we spent about an hour there just dancing. After we got tired of it, we decided to head back to the bar and hang out there until midnight. Once we got there, Yarezi's mom paid for a drink for each of us, but left soon after that because she was tired. It's about 10:30 at this point, and Yarezi, Nadia, and I are enjoying our drinks and having fun dancing. Nadia tried some of my drinks since it was one she hadn't had before. I constantly have my guard up when drinking in public, and I felt safe at this bar because it was 90% gay men who I thought would not have an interest in me. I went back to the bar to get a second drink, and that's the last thing I remember. The rest I've gathered from Yarezi and Nadia. Almost immediately after getting my second drink, I asked Nadia to go to the bathroom with me because I wasn't feeling well, even though I was completely fine 10 minutes before. Once in the bathroom, I just collapsed on the floor and was almost unresponsive. Nadia, now worried, somehow dragged my lifeless body out to where Yarezi was waiting for us. Security, seeing my condition and assuming I was wasted, asked us to leave. Yarezi and Nadia decided to take me back to the hotel about half a mile away. By this point, I was unconscious, and there were barely sounds escaping from my mouth. They saw someone leave the bar at the same time as us who was walking near us, but they were preoccupied with trying to keep my lifeless body off the ground. At one point, I threw up all over myself, them, and the sidewalk. The next part of the story we had to get from Yarezi because Nadia doesn't have much memory of this. Still struggling to carry me, the man they saw leave the bar approached them. He was hitting on Nadia, trying to get her to grab a drink with him. She was very agitated and told him to leave, saying her friend needed help right now. He didn't take no for an answer and continued to follow us down the street, asking if we wanted to get drinks with him and if he could help carry me and such. A middle-aged woman witnessing this came up and told the man off, saying something along the lines of, "Stop harassing these young women or I'm going to call the police." Thankfully, he left after that. Next, by some miracle, an EMT and his wife, enjoying the holiday, ran into us on the street. He checked me out to make sure something wasn't majorly wrong and then carried me the rest of the way to my motel and into the room since my friends could barely hold me up. They thanked him profusely, and him and his wife left. This is where Nadio's memory kicks back in a little bit. 5 minutes later, they get a knock on the door, and it's the EMT and his wife again. They came to let us know that a man followed us to the hotel, and they just saw him hop the gate and start to make his way to our room. My friends called hotel security, but they were unable to find him. My friends didn't get a glimpse of him, but I'm sure it was the same man from earlier. I spent the rest of the night vomiting everything in my body and dry heaving. After that, I woke up the next morning in a pile of pillows and blankets on the bathroom floor. My last memory was at the bar getting a second drink, and my friends filled me in on everything that happened. Feeling like crap, I thought I must have drunk way too much, but I've never blacked out before in my life, and the amount of drinks I had, only 2 in 2 hours, since I didn't get to my second at the bar, didn't add up to me being completely unconscious. We all decided that my first drink had to have been drugged since Nadia had some of it and had no memory of our walk even though she was fully functional. I'm sure that the man that was talking to Nadia and then followed us back was the one that slipped something in my drink. To this day, I don't really know how I could have been slipped something because I got my drink from the bar and never set it down. My best guess was that it was already in the cup. Thankfully, I had a good friend and kind strangers protecting me that night. It keeps me up at night thinking about what could have happened under different circumstances. A few years ago, when I was 18, I was coming home from watching the fireworks display on New Year's Eve. It was 3 a.m. when I reached my safe, family-friendly, nothing ever happens neighborhood. I'm from Sydney, Australia, and live in a posher and wealthier area. My friends wanted to call a taxi because we didn't want to wake our poor parents at this hour to drive us back home, but because of my stubbornness and insistence, we ended up taking the very long walk home. My friend Kieran was complaining most of the time. I guess I can't blame him. Bevis was just silent and compliant, and I was cheerful. When we reached almost my street, we split ways. The guys went on their very long walk home, which was way longer than mine, and I continued on mine. When I passed a little cake shop, I noticed a guy across the street. I only looked at him briefly, but something in the way he quickly looked up at me, almost with interest, caught my attention. I hurried on anyway because I'm usually paranoid about things, and 99% of the time, it's just me being paranoid. I turned onto my street, which was much darker than I had anticipated. This was about 3:15 a.m., mind you. As I passed the bowling club, I kept looking behind me just to make sure. It was getting quite cold and dark, so I started feeling creeped out, but there was no one behind me, no one anywhere as far as I could see. I was halfway down my street where the road dips down when I noticed something on the path in front of me. I couldn't tell what it was, and at the last minute, I stepped off the path onto the road to avoid it because it looked like it might be a dead animal. As I stepped onto the road, I turned slightly and saw that there was someone behind me. They weren't too close, but they weren't too far away either, and I remember my heart leaping into my throat because I hadn't seen them before, and for them to have gotten that close in that short space of time, something about it didn't sit well with me. When I told people about this later, they said that I should have been quite suspicious then. It was 3 a.m. in the morning, and you're quietly walking behind a girl, not even bothering to keep a safe distance. Like, if you're really innocent, you would take measures to emphasize that, right? I couldn't see who it was, nor could I tell if it was male or female because it was just a black figure to me. It was a very brief glimpse. I was scared, though, so I whipped out my phone and started to call Kieran. I kept calling him, but silly Vodafone couldn't connect to him. So I tried to call Bevis, but he wouldn't pick up. I kept this up at least 5 times, getting increasingly anxious but daring not to look behind me to see if he was still there. I'm glad I didn't actually. I think I would have really freaked out if I had confirmed it. By that time, I'd reached my driveway, and I hurried up it thinking I was safe. But as I was halfway up, I looked over my shoulder again, just really quickly, and I saw the figure there again. The way I explained this next bit is going to be hard because I was really confused and muddled. On one hand, it may have looked like he was merely passing my driveway, but on the other hand, I am much more certain that it looked like he was just about to step onto the driveway as if to walk up. At that precise moment that I thought that, it occurred to me that he might be my brother Hubert because no one else would bother walking up my driveway. Even if some guy was following me, it never occurred to me that he would really go to the lengths of going up my driveway as well. I thought I was completely safe because I had the advantage of having my house close by when he started following me. However, something about the build of this figure didn't seem like Hubert to me, so I hurried on anyway. My beautiful, wonderful, amazing mother had stayed up to wait for me, and I'm so glad because she opened the door for me as soon as I knocked. I hate to imagine what would have happened if I'd had to wait for a while. I went inside, but I left the second door open and the outside light on because I thought Hubert might be coming in any second now. But Mom was like, "You can turn them off. Your brother came back 2 hours ago." I did get a little bit creeped out, but I just dismissed the thought because we are so quick to always think we're safe. I closed the door, shut off the light, and went to get a drink of water, and Mom went to bed. I went to my room to grab my clothes and then went to the bathroom to take a shower. I switched off the living room lights. This is sort of funny now that I think about it. Before I took a shower, I replied back to a message from Kieran, who was asking if I was home safe yet. I demanded to know why he hadn't picked up his phone and then told him I was creeped out for a few minutes, but I was okay now. As I showered, I actually thought about that figure. I wasn't too convinced that it was following me, but my mind did teeter into wondering this or that. In any case, I remember thinking that it was okay because I was safe now. Near the end of my shower, I heard something at the window. It didn't sound like the usual creaking or bumping of an old house. The way I described it to other people was like the sound of someone resting their hands against the window to steady themselves. It sounded really unnatural. I know because it caught my attention straight away, and I immediately jumped to the possibility that there might be someone outside. I know that only a really strange sound would make me do what I did next, which was to turn off the water and crouch under the window, hiding and waiting. I waited for quite some time, too scared to move for a few minutes, but there was nothing. So I gingerly crawled out, still too scared to stand up properly, and I switched off the bathroom lights. But then it was impossible for me to dry myself and dress myself, so I turned on the heater light, which is much smaller and dimmer. As I did that, I noticed that there was a very small blue light there that certainly didn't belong there. The way I can describe it now, it was almost like a keypad of a phone lit up. I was scared, but I switched off the heater light as well and backed into the corner, my towel wrapped around me, and I waited. It seemed like a long time that I waited, too scared to unlock the door and move because I knew it would make a lot of noise. As I waited in the pitch darkness, several blue lights came on outside the window. A few became very bright, and they were moving, trying to shine through the window. Now that I think about it, it had to be a phone, but I'm not sure because there were a few lights. But that did it for me because I practically bolted for my mom. I unlocked the door and went into my parents' room, trembling like a leaf and gibbering that there was someone outside the bathroom window. I was clearly very upset, so Mom ushered me around, trying to find a safe room for me to change into. Dad apparently heard the footsteps hurrying back down the driveway, and I'm glad he did because the situation feels so surreal to me now that I'm not even sure if it really happened. Maybe I imagined it all, but this is confirmation that it wasn't just my imagination. I was so shaky, and I slid into bed and couldn't sleep until morning. Even when it was morning, I was terrified, especially when I heard Dad leave the house and go into the backyard. That was the lesson I learned. I'm never walking home again at night. I'm even a bit worried during the daytime now. We never did find out who it was. People wonder if it was the same person I passed earlier, but for some reason, I didn't think so. My brother doesn't think so either. This past New Year's was my and my boyfriend's 4-year anniversary. We typically don't do much, so this year, we decided to make it special by planning a romantic getaway. At the time, the two of us were living in Seattle, and we wanted to rent a cabin in a snowy small town for the weekend. We found a cabin on Airbnb with a hot tub, and we were sold. The cabin was, of course, the last house on the road. To get to it, you had to drive down a small remote private road that ended in a roundabout. Off the roundabout was a long uphill driveway leading up to our cabin. We got to the cabin, and it was snowy and beautiful. The cabin itself sat on top of a garage, and you needed to take stairs on the back side of the property to get to the front door. When we got inside, there was a booklet with all the cabin's info outlined. The book said that during the snowy season, don't be surprised if their contracted snow plowers showed up to clear off the driveway. Okay, sounds good. So we unpacked and realized that there was no service on either of our phones, but the booklet told us that there was a landline in the cabin if we needed anything. We spent the first night by the fire, playing board games and drinking wine. The weekend was exactly what we needed. We planned to spend the next day in town, and that night I had booked us a reservation for a nice dinner. We were gone almost all day, only returning briefly to get dressed up to enjoy some good food. Dinner was great, and we were excited to head back to the cabin for some champagne and hot tubbing. While at dinner, the temperature had dropped, and it snowed for the first time that day, coating everything in a fresh layer of powder. We drove down the private road and got to the driveway. At that point, my boyfriend stopped the car, headlights shining in front, and asked if I noticed the new tire tracks. I looked at the driveway, hoping to quickly disregard the new tire tracks, but there they were. Immediately, we remembered that the snow plowers could have stopped by, but the issue was we saw the tire tracks because of the snow, and who plows in the dark? We also knew that once we were at the cabin, we had no service on our cell phones. So we figured we would head back into town and message our Airbnb host and ask if they or any of their friends had stopped by. We waited for a while in town for a reply from our host, but we didn't hear back. We could have called, but at that point, it was past 10, and we didn't want to be bad guests. We figured we blew the whole thing out of proportion and might as well head back to the cabin. After all, I am big into true crime and spooky subreddits and horror movies, so I was probably just psyching myself out. My boyfriend drove us back. This time, we actually drove up the driveway towards the top of the hill. Part of the driveway, though, I noticed something. My stomach dropped as I noticed footprints on the property. We backed down the driveway and took a closer look to see if there were any more footprints. From what it looked like, someone had driven up the driveway, then reversed down, parked, and then got out of the car and walked all around the property. The property was quite large, with tons of trees and brush, and we knew that these footprints could go anywhere. The moment we saw the footprints, we decided to call the police. We figured it was better safe than sorry, and we would just have the officer go onto the property with us to check everything out. We drove down the road till we got service, called the police, and waited for their arrival. The policeman showed up, and we followed him onto the property. The officer scanned the property and determined there was no one out there. Obviously, we were a little bit shaken up and very embarrassed. We thanked the officer as he left. Needless to say, neither of us wanted to sit in a hot tub in the dark woods after what had happened. Instead, we locked the doors and watched a movie with champagne. We were both tired from the day and passed out pretty quickly. At 2 a.m., we both woke up on the couch with the TV on and all the lights laughing about how the night didn't turn out as planned. As my boyfriend went to brush his teeth, we heard a noise. It sounded mechanical and only lasted a few seconds. We looked at each other and froze. The garage door. There are very few reasons that someone would need to open the garage door of a guest-occupied Airbnb at 2 o'clock in the morning. Like I said, we woke up with all of the lights on, and the cabin had lots of windows. We knew that if someone was outside, they knew that we were here and that they could see us. I immediately grabbed the landline and dialed 911. Once again, we sat crouched in the Airbnb, praying for the police to arrive. We knew that whoever had made those tracks was still on the property, and this time they were making noise. As I sat talking to the operator, we heard a bang on our balcony as if someone was throwing something up onto it. I was losing my absolute mind when the operator told me the police were nearby. All of a sudden, they were there. We saw the police lights and watched them search everything. Then, soon, we heard banging on the door. It was the police, and we were okay now. At the door were two policemen, one in front of us and one a little behind, kind of kicking around the snow and looking at the ground. I immediately noticed the police officer in the back as the officer who did the initial check on the property. The officer told us that not only was the garage door shut, but it was locked, and again, there were no signs of someone on the property. We discussed leaving, but the officer said the road conditions were too dangerous at that time of night. I looked at the officer who had to come out to the property twice, and I felt I had deeply disappointed him. My boyfriend and I went back inside, locking all the doors again, and we tried to sleep. The next day, we were leaving. While we survived the night, I didn't feel right in the cabin anymore. It was forever the spooky cabin in my head, and I just wanted to leave. As we packed, we heard the same noise that we heard at 2 a.m. That's when I had the realization that it was the heater all that time. It was just the heater in the garage making this noise. My boyfriend looked at me and immediately said, "You need to give up your murder shows," and then walked away. As for the banging on the balcony, it was just a perfectly timed fall of a pine cone. I promise I'm not paranoid. I think back on this story a lot and I'm embarrassed about how little came of it, but also incredibly grateful for the same reason. The woman in the wedding dress. I'm a 25-year-old female with a 15-year-old brother and have lived in Queens, New York my whole life. 10 years ago, for those too lazy to do math, I was 15 and my brother was 5. I decided to take my brother to a massive street fair on a main street that stretched very far. The street was shut down. There were some scattered officers of the law, and everything else was street vendors and some awesomely shitty little carnival rides for kids. A group of my friends joined us. In total, there were 10 of us. After having a fun-filled day and introducing my brother to the deep-fried goodness of Zeppels and whatnot, we went to a pizzeria right by the fair. The place wasn't wide but was long. The booths that lined the wall on the right sat 3 people on each side. Then there was a narrow aisle and booths that sat 2 people on each side on the right. Being a half-decent big sister, I had my brother in the 6-seater booth in between me and a friend. This is where things start to get kind of creepy. In walks a man and woman who genuinely looked like they did way too many drugs. They were probably in their late 50s and early 60s. We wouldn't have noticed them if it wasn't for the fact that the woman was wearing a wedding dress, long sleeves, puffy at the shoulders, and long but sort of form-fitting in a way. This dress, however, must have once been white but was now yellowed with age and very dirty. She sat with the man parallel to our booth, our other friends sitting behind them, and a young couple with their 3 to 4-year-old daughter in front. The woman looked around, spotted my brother, and began to talk to him. "You're adorable. How'd you like to come home with me?" My brother has always been a bright kid and ignored her, eating his pizza. "Come on, little boy, you don't want to be around these teens." I nicely turned my face to the lady and asked her politely to leave us alone. She stood up and came to our table, trying to reach over to touch my brother. My friend stood up and blocked her. She went and sat down and started harassing the young couple and their daughter. After about 10 minutes, my brother announced he had to go to the bathroom. When my brother stood up and headed for the bathroom, 5 steps away, the woman asked him if he'd like her to help. At this point, I told her to get lost and leave my brother alone. She tried to push past me and rush to my brother in the bathroom, but another friend was standing in front of the door, basically guarding him. She cursed me out and sat down. As soon as he came out, I picked him up and carried him out. She tried to grab him from me, but there were 10 of us and 1 of her. We went to the nearest officer and told him what was up, and he ran to the pizzeria. Come to find out, she actually abducted a kid from the fair, but when the child started screaming bloody murder, she put him down and ran. Creepy carnival workers. So this happened when I was younger, quite a while ago, but it's one of the creepiest things that has ever happened to me, and I thought y'all might like to hear it. Anyways, I was probably about 10 or 11 years old, and my mom dropped me and my younger brother off at this little carnival thing in the supermarket parking lot. I don't know if they really do stuff like that anymore, but they used to set up smaller carnivals with maybe like 10 rides and a couple of food vendors. Anyways, we had been there for maybe an hour, and I noticed that this guy had been watching us for a while. Then I realized that he was sort of following us around to the different rides. I figured he was one of the workers since he was wearing a carnival hat and his clothes were pretty much the same colors as the other people working there. I would look around and spot him watching us from a couple of rides over or standing next to one of the food stands. Now, I don't want to be rude, but this guy had the creepiest freaking face. One of his eyes looked like it had been swallowed up by this huge swollen eyelid. He had these chapped lips that looked like they were bleeding in places, and he just kept following us around for like 30 minutes, mumbling to himself and staring. After a while, I decided that we should leave and find a way to call my mom. As we were about to leave the carnival area, literally about to walk through the exit, this guy hollers to both of us and grabs my brother's shoulder to pull him back in. He started telling us that we're too young to be there alone and asking where our parents are. I mean, I was young, but there were tons of kids there even younger than us without their parents. He pulled us off to the side area between two rides and pushed us behind him, then just stood guard in front of us like that. I kept asking to use a phone to call my mother since I was still hoping it was actually about us being too young to be there by ourselves. Finally, he gives me this phone that obviously has no SIM card in it or something because it just displays that error message that old phones used to have. I kept begging him to let us go, and he kept muttering, "No, we're going to take you somewhere real safe, real safe." Then he starts laughing and asked if my mom had picked up, which obviously not, and saying he's going to have to take us himself since there's no one else to take us, whatever that he had planned. Finally, we see another worker walking by and I yell to her if I can use her phone. The guy immediately freezes and then just starts walking away like nothing happened. I explained to the woman what had happened and she just looked really confused and kind of worried. I didn't find out until a couple years later, but I guess she told my mom that she didn't think the guy even worked there, that she had never seen him before in her time working. So that happened. I was about 13 to 14 years old at the time, and it was around the 4th of July. Every year around this time, the town I grew up in would have a 4th of July fair in the center of town. It was always a great place to get together with friends without parents, which at that age is a treat. So a few of my friends and I were walking around the fair just hanging out. It was super hot that day, the middle of summer and all, and we were all in tank tops and shorts, mind you. We were still prepubescent at this point, we all blossomed a bit later. So as we stop in front of a carnival game, I turn and see this man, probably mid-30s, in a full cycling gear with sunglasses on. Not weird, there's plenty of cycling enthusiasts in our town. The thing that grabbed my attention, however, was that his hand was down his pants. Me being a naive 13-year-old girl at the time, I laughed and just thought he was adjusting his tight biker shorts or something. As we walked away, I whispered to my friends to check out the guy fixing his shorts, and they looked and also found it funny. We carried on with our day and forgot about the man. Eventually, I don't really remember who approached us specifically, but an older friend of ours told us to get on the sidewalk immediately. When we complied, she told us that the man in the biking gear had been following us around the fair. We were kind of behind a lot of the carts, so we weren't in the main part of the fair where everyone could see, and continued to have his hand down his pants, masturbating as he was following us. Someone obviously called the police and arrested the guy. I heard later that they searched his car and found porn inside and a few other suspicious items, but I never heard any more about him or who he was. My friends and I never really mentioned it after that as well. I don't think we fully grasped the situation at the time and just kind of blocked it out. I mean, still to this day, almost 10 years later, it makes me squirm when I think about it. Let's not meet again ever, creepy cyclist. Every year our small town has a fairly popular carnival and rodeo. It's pretty much the only thing anyone around here looks forward to, or loathes, considering how many drunk tourists seem to find their way here and make fools of themselves dressing like cowboys. One night during the carnival 2 years ago, my mom decided to take my brother, myself, and 2 of my friends for the night to have some fun. We ended up parking on a residential street a few blocks away from the fairgrounds because there's no parking pretty much anywhere else. After a half-ass attempt at remembering the name of the street and the general area where we left our car, we all went on our way. Well, later that night, we couldn't remember for the life of us exactly where the car was. We searched street after street for 30 minutes with no luck. Finally, my mom, after seeing how tired we all were, told us to sit on the curb and wait while she went and looked. We were all well aware of stranger danger and were in a nice neighborhood, plus the community rarely has problems with violence of any sort, so we 3 15-year-old girls and 1 12-year-old boy thought there was nothing to worry about. 5 minutes after my mom disappeared, we hear the grass crunching on the lawn behind us, and all of us whip around to see who was now standing there. An older, lanky man with a hunchback and the coldest expression I'd ever seen was staring at us. Because his back was hunched, he stood there kind of crookedly. He didn't move or blink as he glared at us. "Why are you sitting on my curb?" he snapped, still not moving. It was unnerving how still he was. We immediately felt guilty, thinking this was just some scared or confused old man wondering why some teenagers were sitting outside of his house. I explained the situation to him, that my mom had gone to find our car and we would move across the street if we were bothering him. He stayed silent for a few seconds, then stared me down and said, "Come inside." The next few minutes are a blur as my adrenaline kicked in, and I was getting more and more scared of this man by the second. We didn't have the sense to just run. For some reason, he kept repeating, "Come inside." "What are you waiting for? Come inside my house. Get over here now. Get in my house." No matter what we said, he didn't seem to hear, and he thankfully didn't move from his spot on the lawn, like he just expected us to come with him. He was especially focused on my friend and me, just telling us over and over again to go with him inside his house. No matter how much we tried to get in his head that my mom was coming back soon, the look in his eyes just kept getting colder and more furious the longer he stood there. It didn't occur to me that his hand had been hidden behind his back the entire time until my mom showed up. We were all relieved, saying, "See, we told you, there she is." And like now, my mom is a scary woman. She does not take shit and she'll happily start throwing punches if she feels the situation calls for it. So immediately she was in mama bear mode and furiously telling off this old man after she saw how freaked out we all were. He was just now starting to move back to his house. He slunk away from her and glared at the 4 of us, batting his free hand at her, cursing and mumbling to himself. We watched him go, and as he turned around, my blood went cold. In the hand that he had been hiding was a large knife. It glinted off the street lamp, and we all hurried away to our car that my mom had found. My friends and I tried to laugh it off, but we were all scared and not willing to be alone for the rest of the night. It's seriously scary to think about what was running through that old man's head, especially since he was holding that damn knife the whole time. So, creepy old man with a knife behind his back, let's not meet. Why I'm done with the local fair. Every year since about the 5th grade, I've gone to our little town fair. It used to be in the mall parking lot, huge, well-kept, polite staff, and always busy for the week or so it was here. But the last 2 years, it's been rather small and kind of shady. The staff moved to a smaller, empty lot behind our local Outback. This year, my boyfriend took me as a little, "I'm sorry we're not going to prom" gesture. We're walking around for a little bit. It's still pretty early in the day, so it seems like mostly little kids and their parents are there. He and I decide we'll go to ride the bull, something I've done quite a few times growing up going to rodeos. This was his first time. I paid for him and begged him to do it with me. I explained what he had to do, how he can't hold on with 2 hands and whatnot, and he does well for his first time, about 15 seconds at full speed and shaking. Now it's my turn. I hop on and ride with no issues. I'm wearing skinny jeans, so I'm not entirely shocked when I get a wolf whistle about the little bit of lace that got flashed on one turn. Turning around thinking it was just my boyfriend, I walk off and walk back up to him, dizzy. A carny comes up and tells me I was one of the longest riders in this town. I quickly thank him and give him a big, proud smile, holding on to my boyfriend. He quickly pulls me away to the carousel and leans down to kiss me. I stand up on my tiptoes to reach him. The same carny, apparently working this ride, comes up to us and, in the most sarcastic tone possible, goes, "Aren't you cute?" Keep in mind, this guy is probably about 30 years old and smells like weed mixed with fair food. He looks at my boyfriend and goes, "But maybe she deserves someone a little better fit for her, or at least knows how to ride a bull." I pull my boyfriend out of line, pissed off and grossed out. He tells me we'll go when the guy's not there. We walk around some more, get some treats, and ride some other things. Probably about an hour later, we head back to the carousel. I'm carrying my big stuffed koala bear, and we get back in line. No sign of the creepy carny. We get our wristbands, stand, and get on. I sit on the outside while my boyfriend sits on the middle horse. The ride's going, and suddenly the creepy carny is back. He hops on quickly and holds on to the pole my horse is attached to. He just stares at me for a bit until I go, "Can I help you?" My boyfriend is watching, slightly amused. I'm not something to be messed with, and he knows as much. The carny looks at me, his gross yellow teeth stretched out in a grin, and goes, "Yeah, how about you show me more of that lace, and I'll get you a bigger bear than that sad thing." I'm completely disgusted and creeped out. I tell him to fuck off before I call the cops, and he's not getting the message until the ride stops. My boyfriend stands up, he towers over this guy and goes, "Hey, she said fuck off or I'll have the cops here in 2 minutes." The creepy carny buggers off and follows us around the rest of the night until I'm so freaked out we have to leave. So, creepy carnival worker, let's not meet again. Starting a new job is always a mix of excitement and nerves. When I landed a summer job at a local carnival in downtown LA, I was just looking for some extra cash before my senior year of college started in the fall. The carnival was a typical setup with rides, games, and food stands, but its main attraction was the fun house, which doubled as a haunted house after dark. It was actually a solid structure that I think used to be some old guy's mansion or something. I was assigned to manage the fun house, which was a favorite among the carnival goers. It seemed simple enough: guide the guests in, ensure they have a fun, safe time, and observe them leave. At first, everything seemed straightforward, but then I started noticing odd things. It started with small discrepancies. I'd count a dozen people entering, but only 11 would emerge. At first, I chalked it up to miscounting. After all, keeping track in the chaos of laughter and screams was no easy task. However, as the days passed, the numbers just didn't add up. 7 went in, 6 came out, 10 went in, 9 came out. Was I going crazy? Something was off, and I couldn't ignore it much longer. One particularly busy afternoon, a blonde girl caught my eye as she walked up to the fun house. She was drop-dead gorgeous and almost seemed out of place amidst the childlike atmosphere. She couldn't have been more than a few years older than me. I genuinely had to do a double take. I'm not a weird guy by any means, but I couldn't help but lock eyes with her for a few seconds. She smiled, handed me her ticket, and I directed her into the attraction. After she disappeared into the darkness, I went back to my duties. Time ticked by, and I watched attentively as people entered and exited, sometimes asking me questions and whatnot. Admittedly, I was paying a little more attention to the guests that night, as I wanted to see that girl as she left and maybe work up the courage to talk to her. Pretty soon, I started picking up on the fact that groups of people who had entered after her were beginning to emerge. A few more minutes passed, and I started getting worried. She should have been out by now. Compelled by genuine concern, I decided to abandon my post for a few minutes and go looking for her. I stepped inside and locked the entrance door. I began investigating, navigating the dimly lit rooms and narrow corridors. I moved through the house until I came across something I had noticed during my initial walkthrough, a barely noticeable seam in the wall. I'm not really sure what I was expecting, but curiosity got the best of me. I pressed against the seam, and I heard a distinct click. I played around with it some more, and my jaw nearly hit the floor when I realized it was a hidden door. It swung open slowly, revealing a pitch-black hallway. I stood there in shock. What in the world was this doing here? I was definitely going to have a long conversation with my boss about this. I walked into the hallway with my phone's flashlight guiding the way. I didn't have much brain power to spend being nervous because I was still so shocked about the whole situation. I got to the end of the passage and found another door. I flung it open, and to my surprise, it was a concealed exit that led back to the carnival grounds. I breathed a sigh of relief as this discovery proved I wasn't going crazy. All those people I had noticed leaving the attraction had probably stumbled across that secret door by accident and assumed it was the correct way to go. As I walked back the way I had come, I couldn't help but feel a little bummed out that I wasn't going to get the chance to talk to that girl. I'm not sure what came over me, but I decided to keep exploring the funhouse instead of returning to my post. I think a part of me just wanted a few extra minutes of this impromptu break I was taking. I walked through a couple more rooms, and that's when I noticed it. On one of the walls was another faint seam identical to the first one I had seen. I again played with it until it clicked and swung open. I could immediately tell this one was very different. The putrid smell was the first thing I noticed. More concerning, though, was the fact that there was no corridor in this one, but a ladder. A ladder that led downwards. I was more confused than anything. This door was on the ground floor, and I was told specifically that this place didn't have a basement. I debated climbing down, but I just felt awful about the prospect that the girl might be down there. So, against my instincts, I began the descent. The smell only got worse as I climbed down into the darkness. I was expecting to find a basement, but what I found instead was far, far worse. I got to the bottom and pulled out my phone's flashlight. I was frozen in shock. I was literally standing in a tunnel that extended into the darkness. There was literally no way that this was part of the house above. The rational part of my brain screamed to turn back, to forget about it, but the mystery was too compelling. I ventured further, being careful not to make any noise. The walls were damp, and the tunnel was completely silent. As I explored, my flashlight beam fell on something unexpected. A white glittery purse was sitting in the middle of the corridor. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands. It looked familiar, and then it hit me. It was that girl's purse. I was sure of it. I started to panic. Was she really down here? I doubted there was any way a rational person could find this tunnel and not turn around, but the proof was literally in my hands. My mind started racing. Was she hurt? Lost? And then a more terrifying thought hit me, was she alone? I didn't feel safe anymore, but I was in too deep. Violating every survival instinct I had, I yelled out into the tunnel for that girl. I waited. Nothing. I was just about to shout again when I heard the sound of rapid footsteps echoing through the tunnels. My first instinct was to run. I had every reason to believe whoever was running toward me was hostile. I turned around and bolted back to the ladder. I got halfway up and slipped, falling back to the bottom. The footsteps were basically right on top of me now. I knew I was done for. I braced myself for a fight, and then a voice rang out, a girl's voice. Her voice. She gasped, clutching her side as if in pain. I yelled at her to climb up, but she insisted that I follow her back into the darkness. For some reason, I told her there was no chance I was doing that and basically forced her up the ladder. We got to the top, and I slammed the door shut. I asked her how in the world she ended up down there, and she couldn't really give me a straight answer. She kept saying she didn't really remember how it happened, just that she suddenly realized she was underground. She said she started hearing things moving in the dark and that there were voices calling to her. I didn't know how to process this. I asked her if someone had guided her down there, and she said she didn't remember. The weirdest thing about her story was that she was looking at me with this blank stare that genuinely freaked me out. I basically interrogated her about why she told me to stay down there, but she didn't answer. I had had enough. I wanted to get as far away from this person as possible. I called the police, but she opted to leave the fun house before they got there. I never saw her again. The police investigated, and what they found was actually insane. Apparently, this house had been some sort of safe house during Prohibition in the 1920s. As such, it had a bunch of secret passageways that led to a section of the underground Prohibition tunnels that hadn't been discovered. The owner claimed he had no idea about the house's history, but I was skeptical. I quit my job and got as far away from there as possible. I still have so many questions. Did the owner know about this? Was that girl almost kidnapped? Had someone knocked her out and taken her down there or something? Was she part of the whole thing? I feel like there are a number of explanations for what happened to me, but all of them are equally terrifying. Ever since I was a kid, I loved carnivals. The lights, the games, the unpredictable joy of it all. I know lots of people find them weird and childish, but not me. Growing up in a small town in Indiana, it's not like there was a whole bunch to do. So whenever the carnivals would roll through town, you best believe I was spending as much time there as I possibly could. It's been over 20 years, and I still enjoy the atmosphere of a local carnival. Despite what I'm about to tell you, I think my love for carnivals is something I'll never lose. I was like 9 or 10 when this happened, and I was a kind of nerdy kid growing up. In the days leading up to the spring carnival, I found myself in the library reading up on whatever I found interesting at the time. For whatever reason, I wound up in the history section. I remember the books being literally caked in layers of dust. That's how long it had been since they were even touched. I was flipping through a book on the history of our town when a small, faded slip of paper fell out from between the pages. Confused, I leaned down to pick it up. To my pleasant surprise, it was a ticket for our local spring carnival, dated over 15 years ago. The odds of something like that happening had to be extremely low. I was ecstatic. This ticket would make a great addition to my miscellaneous collection back home. What was even cooler, though, was the fact that the date on the ticket was just 2 days away, when the carnival would certainly be in town. As I predicted, the carnival cruised into town the next morning, so I figured, why not use the old ticket just for laughs, to see what the booth attendant would say. I wanted to get it punched anyway. The next evening, I headed to the carnival with the ticket safely tucked away in my pocket. As I approached the entrance, the carnival seemed just as lively as ever, the air filled with the scent of cotton candy and popcorn. I pulled out the ticket at the gate, handing it over to the guy at the booth. His face changed the moment he saw it. He went pale, his eyes widening slightly before he masked his reaction with a forced smile. It was honestly a little creepy. Enjoy your evening," he stammered, handing me back the ticket without punching it. I was so weirded out by his reaction that I forgot to ask him to punch it. I shrugged it off, though, thinking maybe he was just new and confused about the old design of the ticket. I wandered around, played some games, and enjoyed a funnel cake. The night was perfect, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I felt eyes on me, observing. Maybe it was just paranoia. I tried to ignore it at first, but I kept noticing the carnival employees giving me weird looks. After a while, I got fed up and decided to ask one of the older game operators about it. I found a kindly-looking elderly man running the ring toss booth. I showed him the ticket, and unlike the booth guy, he didn't even try to hide his shock. He glanced around nervously before leaning closer. "Young man, where did you get this?" he asked. After telling him where I found it, I started feeling uneasy about the whole situation. Maybe I should have just kept the ticket at home. "You found something you weren't meant to find," the old man started, his voice dropping to a whisper. This ticket, it's part of a story that the folks around here don't talk about much. About 15 years ago, something terrible happened during the carnival right here in this town. He paused as if weighing whether to continue. There was a young worker, name of Win, nice kid, everybody liked him. He was responsible for one of the rides. I can't remember which. One night, he just disappeared, vanished without a trace. The police found his wallet, but there was nothing in it except a ticket that looked an awful lot like this one, he said, gesturing towards my hands. The atmosphere around us seemed to drop a few degrees. He continued, they searched everywhere, even drained the local pond, but no sign of him. After that, strange things started happening every time the carnival stopped here, accidents, things going missing, odd sightings. People said it was when trying to come back, or something worse that took him. I could feel a chill running down my spine, but a part of me was skeptical. And you believe that? I asked. The old man shrugged. I've seen enough to keep an open mind. But the point is, the ticket you found might stir things up. It's best you get rid of it. Leave it here. He then motioned for me to give it to him, but I was reluctant. I looked down at it, reading it over again as if there was some kind of secret I was missing. How could a ticket be the cause of all that? I questioned, still not fully buying it. The look in his eye got darker, his tone switched almost as if he were angry. Give it here, he told me, almost in a growl. I considered it but concluded that some stupid story wasn't worth giving up such a cool souvenir. I told him no, and he actually sprung up with a quickness that startled me. He reached for the ticket, his fingers grazing my hand. I jerked back instinctively, clutching the ticket tighter. The old man's expression morphed into something desperate, almost predatory. You don't understand, he hissed, his eyes darting around as if expecting something or someone to emerge from the shadows. I backed away towards the tense exit, my heart pounding. I think I should go, I stammered, turning to lose myself in the crowd. Behind me, I could hear his calls, a mix of pleading and warning. I didn't care what he was saying though. I let the bustling crowd around me drown his voice out. My mind was racing, not even about the ticket, but more so his aggressive reaction. The joy of the carnival had been spoiled. I left earlier than planned, the ticket burning a hole in my pocket. Over the next few days, my luck seemed to turn sharply. I missed catching the school bus, scraped my knee pretty bad in a bike accident, and worst of all, my best friend accused me of stealing his favorite baseball card, something I would never do. Things got worse than that, though. I remember coming home one night to my mother in tears after losing her job. My brother broke his leg skateboarding the next week, and our beloved family pet, Bean, also passed away a few days after that. It was like a dark cloud had settled over me since that night at the carnival. I couldn't help but remember the old man's warning about the ticket stirring things up. It seemed ridiculous, but then again, so was the string of bad luck that followed me. My dad laughed when I told him about my theory. He told me that there was no such thing as ghosts and that I shouldn't be so superstitious. One rainy afternoon after school, after a particularly tough day where I had forgotten my lunch and had to go hungry, I pulled the ticket out. I stared at it, this small piece of paper that had brought nothing but trouble. Feeling a mix of anger and fear, I decided I had had enough. I grabbed my raincoat and boots and trudged out to the creek that ran behind our house. My heart felt like it was pounding out of my chest as the rain soaked through my hair. Standing at the creek's edge, I took one last look at the ticket before tearing it into tiny pieces and watching them get swept up by the current. It's just a piece of paper, I thought. Things started to look up after that. My friend found his baseball card and apologized to me, and we became friends again. I didn't miss the bus a single time that school year. My mom got a better job in the next couple of days. Whether it was all a coincidence or that ticket really was cursed, I couldn't say, but one thing was for sure, I learned to be more careful about what I picked up and brought home. I don't believe in the supernatural, even after all this stuff happened to me. My parents liked telling me that I imagined everything because I was so young. It's still hard to fully explain it, but I've long since accepted it as one of those weird coincidences that you just can't explain. I hate carnivals. I think they're disgusting and filled with children. I hate the food, the games, and the smell of it all. My hatred of carnivals is probably biased, though, and mostly based on what I'm about to tell you. A few years ago, I was dragged to our local carnival by my younger sister. I obviously wasn't going to be rude and not go, but I wasn't looking forward to it. After a while, my sister got bored and wanted to leave, so I called my mom to pick us up. I actually opted not to go with them as I was in the midst of a fight with my dad and didn't want to go back home until he was asleep. I told my mom I'd walk home later, so she picked up my sister and left. The carnival was honestly a little pathetic. There were far fewer people there that night than I remember there being in previous years, and everyone looked miserable. I figured I might as well walk around a little to try and get my money's worth. After all, I had paid for a ticket out of my own pocket. I decided to step into the funhouse as I figured that would at least be a little cool. I was expecting there to be a ton of people in there, but it was completely empty. There was literally not a single other person in there as far as I could tell. I had never been inside a funhouse alone before. People don't realize how important the laughter and talking is to the atmosphere. Without it, you're basically just standing there in silence, surrounded by a bunch of weird mirrors. It was honestly a little creepy. I shrugged my shoulders and figured I might as well walk through it. Admittedly, I did get a pretty good laugh out of the distorted mirrors. I think I was like halfway through when I noticed something odd in one of the reflections. To my left, there was a head that seemed to be peering at me. I only saw it for a split second, but it was a bald guy with really sunken eyes. I whipped around but didn't see anyone. To be completely honest, I had no idea where he had even been standing. Since there were mirrors all over the place, he could have literally been anywhere. I thought it was especially creepy since I didn't hear the funhouse entrance open. He either snuck in behind me or he had already been inside. I kept walking, going a little more quickly now, and then I saw him again out of the corner of my eye. He had this deranged smile. This time it was the exact same face, I was positive. I tried to figure out where he was standing, but the reflections were too confusing. I yelled for him to get lost but got no response. I wasn't sure what I was expecting. I picked up the pace again, but it was difficult trying to navigate this maze of mirrors, and I kept hitting dead ends. I started sweating, constantly looking over my shoulder every few seconds. A few minutes later, I turned a corner after hitting another dead end, and a hand reached out from behind one of the mirrors, grabbing my wrist. I screamed, cursing at the guy to let go of me, but he held firm. I punched his arm, forcing him to let go. I fell to the ground in the fray and saw the creepster in his full form. He was wearing all gray, had a bit of a gut, and a tired, sunken face. I jumped to my feet before he could reach for me again and sprinted back the way I came. I don't know if it was survival instincts or not, but finding my way back to the entrance was somehow easier with the adrenaline coursing through my veins. I sprinted out of the funhouse and caught my breath. I reached into my back pocket, and a horrifying realization hit me. I didn't have my wallet. I must have dropped it when I fell. There was no way I was going back in there. After running to the nearest staff person, I told them everything that happened. She seemed confused and told me that the funhouse was closed to patrons that night. I was horrified. They called the police and searched it but found nothing, not even my wallet. I felt like such an idiot. I told them that that guy was probably an ex-employee with a key, but they shrugged off my theory and told me to go home. So reluctantly, that's what I did. It's not like I had gotten hurt or anything. I wish I could tell you the story ended there, but I can't. A week later, my girlfriend called me one night in a panic, frantically screaming into the phone about something terrible that happened. Apparently, Someone had been texting her phone pretending to be me and convinced her to drive out to this remote location to help me change a tire. Thankfully, she decided to bring her dad even though the guy told her to come alone. They pretty quickly realized what was going on when the car parked in the lot wasn't mine. Her dad stepped out of the car, and 6 dudes stepped out of the car in front of them. He sprinted back to the car and hightailed it out of there before those guys could catch up to him. The whole thing made sense. I did have my girlfriend's number written down on a slip of paper in my wallet, which explains how he got her number. Both of us changed all our contact information, and it's been a month without incident. I really don't know how to feel about this whole ordeal. I think I'm just going to try to block the memory out of my head. Tale takes us deep into the darkest corners of the internet, where whispers of accursed games spread like wildfire through online forums and chat rooms. They called it the Grimoire, a text-based role-playing game shrouded in mystery and whispered rumors of misfortune and despair. Legend had it that the game was the creation of a reclusive programmer, a digital recluse who had poured his darkest fears and obsessions into its code. But something went wrong. The game, once intended as harmless entertainment, became corrupted, twisted by an unknown force, its code taking on a life of its own. Rumors spread like wildfire through the online gaming community, tales of players experiencing strange phenomena, their real lives mirroring the events of the game with chilling accuracy. Some claimed to have lost fortunes, their in-game losses translating into real-world financial ruin. Others whispered of broken relationships, accidents, even disappearances, all linked to the game's malevolent influence. The game, it seemed, had a way of reaching out from the screen, of blurring the lines between the virtual and the real with terrifying consequences. Despite the chilling tales, curiosity got the better of many, drawn to the game's mystique like moths to a flame. Among them were 2 friends, Mark and Lucas, avid gamers with a penchant for the strange and unusual. They stumbled upon the Grimoire on a hidden forum, its download link buried beneath layers of cryptic messages and warnings. Intrigued and perhaps a little foolish, they decided to download the game, eager to experience its mysteries firsthand. As they installed the game, a sense of unease settled over them, the computer screen flickering erratically, the room growing noticeably colder. Ignoring the warning signs, they launched the game, its opening screen a jumble of distorted text and disturbing imagery that seemed to writhe and pulsate before their eyes. A single line of text appeared on the screen, its message chilling in its simplicity: "Welcome to the Grimoire. You have been warned." Undeterred, Mark and Lucas created their characters, their avatars appearing on the screen as pixelated representations of themselves, their features strangely distorted, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. The game world was a dark and unforgiving place, a labyrinth of shadowy forests and crumbling ruins populated by grotesque creatures and malevolent entities. As they progressed through the game, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, their every move scrutinized by an unseen presence. Strange things began to happen. This is something that happened to me when I was much younger. I believe I was about 11 or 12 during this time. I lived at home with my older brother and my parents. One of my favorite things to do after school most days was to unwind by playing some video games. I would go upstairs to my bedroom and start playing on my PlayStation 2 for a while. Sometimes, I would play all the way until it was time for dinner. So, one day I got home from school and went straight up to my bedroom to play some video games. Both my parents were still at work, and my brother was still at school. That's how things usually were for an hour or 2 after I got back on most days. I remember playing video games, and a little while in, I heard my brother getting home downstairs. The front door opened and closed, and I heard him walk inside. I thought nothing of it and I kept gaming. But about an hour later, I got a call from my mom. I had a home phone in my bedroom and saw through the caller ID that it was my mom's cell phone. When I answered, she told me that she was on her way to pick up my brother from his friend's house, and they would be home soon. My dad was going to pick up some food on the way home from work, and she wanted to know what I wanted. I told her whatever food it was that I was in the mood for that night. Then we said bye, and I hung up. It was only after ending the call that I realized it was strange that my brother was not home. If he was at a friend's house, then who had I heard entering our house? My heart started racing, and I had a terrible feeling. I carefully walked to my bedroom door and opened it up. I had never heard the person walking upstairs or near my bedroom. I didn't know where they went after entering the house. So, after not hearing or seeing anything, I left my bedroom. I quietly walked down the hallway and looked downstairs. I still saw nothing. Then I went down the stairs. Once there, I walked around the main level of the house looking. I did not see anybody, but when I was near the kitchen and kind of the front door, I heard a noise coming from the basement. It sounded like somebody was down there. I quickly ran away and went back upstairs to my bedroom. A short time after entering my room, I heard the front door to the house open and close again. At that point, I ran back downstairs. When I got to the front door, I saw what looked like a man walking away down the street. I didn't recognize him and only saw him for like 2 seconds. It might not have been the same guy who had been in the house, but I think it was. I then locked all the doors and called my parents, who then called the police. The door had been left unlocked for when my brother got home. I hadn't known he was going to a friend's house. Looking back, I can't believe it happened. I didn't even know I was home alone with some random guy downstairs. I'm really glad that he didn't go near my bedroom. This happened when I was like 16 and in my heavy gaming phase, still living with my parents. I played a lot of League of Legends in my room on my computer in those days, especially in the summertime when it's so unbearably hot outside and I preferred to stay inside in the air conditioning. Anyway, way back when I lived at home, I'd have the place to myself a lot because my parents traveled a lot and I was the last one to move out. If I recall correctly, this was on a Friday night or a night that school was out the next day because I was staying up late. After I got home from school, I submitted a paper that was due that night to get it over with. Then, I had to do some shopping afterward on my mom's orders since they'd be gone for a while. It was how I earned my keep in the house, according to my dad. They left cash for me to use. I always had to show them the receipt though so that I wouldn't just pocket any of the money. My mom gave me a shopping list, so I went to Whole Foods in my old Camry, my first car. Shopping took about an hour. While in the grocery store, this guy in line behind me started talking to me, and I don't know why. He made a comment about one of the things I was buying and just wouldn't stop, even as I was bagging my groceries. He kept talking to me, which I found weird. He wasn't paying attention to anyone else. I was still nice though. When it was time to leave, I said, "Have a good one," and left. I went out to my car in the parking lot, packed the trunk, then headed home. It was a scorching hot day as we were in early June. I wasn't looking to go out and do anything outside. Once I was done with everything I needed to do, it was dark out by now, so I got right on League of Legends on my computer and texted my friend David to get on as well. He joined my party, and we played some dual rank as we always did. I was using my noise-canceling headset. We were committed already to playing League of Legends all night and ranking up, so of course, I needed to take a break to make dinner at some point. Probably 2 hours into playing, I told David I was going to eat dinner and I'd probably be back on in an hour. He said he'd be back on later too. So with that, I took a break and made some pasta for dinner. The kitchen is downstairs and my room is upstairs. While I was sitting in the kitchen eating, I knew for sure I heard a thump from upstairs. Did it sound like a footstep? I wasn't sure. It could have been any number of things, but the last thing I'd imagine it would be was a footstep. I did, however, go and lock the front door. Now, oftentimes for a while, I would leave the door unlocked just because my parents' house is in a good side of town, and I just never took the idea of a break-in seriously. It's something you hear about on the news, but don't think it'll ever happen to you. I went upstairs, and I don't know what I was expecting, but I said my brother Tristan's name into the hallway. I knew he wasn't supposed to be here, but I don't know. I heard a sound and I felt the urge to see if anyone was here. When no one answered back, I went back to my room and got back on League of Legends. I put my headset back on and texted David that I'm going back on. Shortly after, he came back on. We started playing again. A couple of games in, I looked to my left at the doorway of my room into the hallway. I don't know if something in my peripheral vision or some other sense felt something there, but I would leave the door open when I was home alone as my mom would tell me to. The hallway was dark except for the one little nightlight plugged into an outlet. My room shone blue from my wall lights. Some of the blue poured into the part of the hallway closest to my room. In between the crack of the door was total blackness. I couldn't see through it. I didn't think anything of it. After our next game, David said he was taking a leak and walked away. While we were in the lobby, I looked at my phone, then looked back out to the hallway, and I noticed something was different. Now I could see through the crack of the door into the hallway. My first thought was someone blocking it just minutes ago? By instinct, I spun my chair around to face the bed behind me, and there was a man sitting on my bed with his freakishly upright posture and his hands resting on his thighs. He almost looked to be smiling. I was so alarmed I jumped out of my seat onto the desk and crawled onto the desk, causing my monitor and basically everything else to fall off of it. I screamed, "What do you want?" and he started to actually smile now, showing his teeth like he was laughing. I ran out of the room into the hallway. I stopped halfway down the hallway and looked back at my bedroom door. I heard the springs of my bed lifting, and then the guy slowly walked into the doorway and stopped. He stood there. I once again yelled, "What do you want?" He then spoke in a stuttered, slow voice, asking if he could play too. I asked, "How did you get in here?" He stepped a few steps forward and pointed down the stairs. I assumed he was implying he entered through the front door. I was at a loss for what to do, so I ran down the stairs to the landline phone, as my cell phone was still in my room. I grabbed the phone and a kitchen knife and screamed, "You need to leave. I'm calling 911. I heard footsteps walking down the steps, and the last time I saw the guy was when he walked past the kitchen, looked at me, and then I heard him walking out the front door. I ran to slam it shut and lock it. For the first time ever, I was ashamed of myself for leaving the door completely unlocked. I held the phone for a few minutes, deciding whether to tell my parents. Ultimately, I did. My mom was concerned at first, then grew livid, so much so to the point that she put my dad on the phone. He told me to go through the house and make sure nothing was taken. I went through every room, and honestly, everything seemed in place. I said the man seemed like something was off about him. The man didn't seem overtly hostile, but something was wrong with him, and I don't know what his intention was. The image of him sitting on my bed and the realization that he was watching me through the crack in the door was haunting enough. This is a story I'm not proud of, mostly for my naivety. When I was in middle school and early high school, I didn't know how to talk to girls at all at school, but that's a lot of boys in middle school. I wasn't shy in general. I had friends and did normal things an 8th grader would do. I just had never kissed a girl or anything. Some of my friends at the time claimed they had already gone further than that with girls, and I was starting to feel pressure. But I was still having trouble approaching girls in that way. The mentality went from boys making fun of girls to suddenly liking them in a matter of like a year. I was a pretty big gamer in middle school and early high school. This was when I was in 8th grade. I was like 13. My voice was still probably a bit prepubescent sounding. It was 2009. I played a lot of console games and computer MMORPG games. My favorite console games at the time were GTA 4 and Call of Duty, and my favorite computer game was this MMORPG called Ganu. It was this online game where you would level up by killing monsters, and the more you leveled up, the higher level monsters and hunting grounds you'd be able to tackle. The online community in this game was very active, and there were tons of players. My older brother used to play it a little bit too. I played it more for sure though. I was in a guild and town and everything. I don't remember how it happened, but I befriended this female player who was a higher level than me. Her username was Pokemon. Anytime I'd sign in and she was on, she'd message me and vice versa. We would join parties together, which meant we'd share EXP on whatever monsters we killed, and we just chatted for hours. She knew a lot about me, including my age and my town and some personal family details she would open up to me too. Eventually, she told me her name was Karina. It was weird feeling such a connection with a girl when really, I knew nothing about her appearance or her voice. It truly was like having a pen pal, but better. It was interesting enough that we both lived in Texas state. She lived about an hour from me. After a few weeks, or maybe even a month, we started talking about maybe meeting one day. To do this, though, we'd have to exchange numbers. At the time, I didn't actually have a cell phone yet. I only had an iPod Touch. However, I was able to download a texting app that allowed me to send messages to people with cell phones. Through this app, I was able to send her a picture of myself. It was definitely this cringy 8th grade boy selfie of me trying to look good looking. She called me cute, and then she sent back a picture of herself. She looked a couple of years older than me, like 15, which was the age she told me she was. Based on the picture, I found her very attractive. This was around the time our messages became more flirtatious and romantic. But we were both minors, so neither of us could just drive an hour away. However, she apparently had a solution for this. She told me her sister had friends that lived around me, and she could probably get a ride to me. This was exciting news for my little 13-year-old self. I wanted to wait for a day and night when my parents wouldn't be home, so I'd have the house to myself. This was about a week later, I believe. My parents were going to the Hamptons for the whole weekend, so it would just be my brother and me home. My brother was 18, so I asked him to please just go out for the night with friends so that I could be alone with Karina. I gave Karina my address and told her to come that Saturday whenever she wanted. She said she'd be coming a little later, like at night. She didn't give me an exact time. At that point, we still had never spoken on the phone. I still hadn't heard her voice. I was so nervous all day that I couldn't even play video games. I was busy cleaning my room, making things look cool, fixing my appearance, and even rehearsing things to say in the initial moments of meeting. Then I got a message from Karina saying she's here. I sprang up and ran to the front door. I looked through the peephole and didn't see anyone. She then said, "You can come out to the front door." I opened the door and stepped onto the front porch. I looked around, and the street was dark and quiet, no cars, no people. I went back inside and shut the door. I messaged her back saying, "I don't see you." She replied, "Oh, I must have the wrong house. Give me a minute." That was a bit weird. I locked the door and sat on the living room couch, nervously waiting and playing games on my iPod. I got a message from her again. She said she's here and to come outside. I replied, "Ring the bell so I know you're at the right house." Then the doorbell rang. My nerves really set in. I walked to the door, looked through the peephole, and didn't see anyone. I said, "Karina." Through the peephole, I saw a hand reach towards the door and knock. I said, "Karina," again as I kept looking through the peephole. Everything felt like it instantly crumbled on top of me as this bald, creepy-looking short guy stepped in front of the peephole and then said through the door, "Hey, it's Pokemon. I want to talk." I ran away from the door with my hands over my mouth, truly speechless. The person I'd been talking to all this time was a creepy grown man. I was disgusted and scared. I went to call my brother's cell phone. He didn't pick up. The doorbell kept ringing. I went to my bedroom and locked myself in. I held the house phone in my grasp, considering calling my parents but too embarrassed to do so. My room was the only other room in the house with the lights on. I have a big window in my room that overlooks the whole side yard of our corner house. I turned off my lamp and slightly kinked the blind just a crack, and I saw that guy on the other side trying to look in. He started to knock on the window and said through the closed window how much of a connection we clearly have and that we could at least be friends. I responded with nothing. I called my brother again, and he picked up this time. I said, "Please come home right now." The Karina person was a grown man the entire time, and he's at my window right now. My brother's always been pretty big, even as a teenager. I'd feel safer with him being here. He said he was coming home with his friends right now. We stayed on the phone so I could tell him if anything happened. I ran to my parents' bedroom upstairs and hid there. The man was blowing up my message app, saying he would like to talk and that there was a reason he had to lie about who he was. When my brother got home, he told me he saw the guy outside. My brother and his 3 friends confronted the creepy short man outside. I went outside then to watch the 4 of them intimidate the man, calling him a sicko. The man's defense was that he was concerned for my well-being, inviting strangers from online over, and that this was supposed to be a learning lesson. I refuted this claim by asking him why he would say that we could be good friends at my window when my brother and his friends started pushing the man. He started quickly walking to his car. My brother kicked the guy's tail light while one of his friends threw a rock at his window. He sped off down the road, never to be seen again. This was humiliating and disturbing, but at the same time, I was really grateful for my brother and his friends coming to my aid. They potentially saved me from a seriously sick creep breaking into the house. It's still painful and uncomfortable realizing all that time I spent opening up to who I thought was a girl my own age on a game was some creepy grown man with a different agenda. Our first story begins on a Friday night, the air thick with anticipation. A young man named Jack, an avid gamer, scoured online marketplaces for a deal on a used console, eager to dive into the latest releases. He stumbled upon an offer that seemed too good to be true, a current-gen console, practically brand new, being sold at a fraction of the retail price. The seller, only identified as KL, was vague in his responses, claiming he simply needed to get rid of it. Despite a prickle of unease, Jack dismissed his better judgment and arranged to meet KL at a dimly lit gas station later that evening. The seller, a gaunt man with nervous eyes, arrived in a beat-up car, the console hastily wrapped in a garbage bag. He practically shoved it into Jack's hands, eager to be rid of the device. Jack, his excitement overriding his apprehension, paid the man and hurried home, eager to boot up his new purchase. As he connected the console to his TV, he noticed an unsettling detail he had overlooked in his haste, a single deep scratch etched across the top of the console, almost resembling a cryptic symbol. Brushing it off as nothing more than cosmetic damage, Jack grabbed his controller and prepared to enter a world of digital entertainment. From the moment he pressed the power button, things felt off. The console whirred to life with an unnatural hum, the fan noise louder and more erratic than it should have been. The screen flickered, displaying distorted images and garbled text before snapping into focus, revealing the console's home screen. But something was different. The usual cheerful background was replaced with a static image of a dark, desolate forest, the trees twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. Jack chalked it up to a corrupted hard drive, a minor inconvenience he could easily fix with a factory reset. As he navigated the console's menu, he noticed strange glitches, the cursor moving on its own, selecting options he hadn't chosen. The console seemed to have a mind of its own, its actions becoming increasingly erratic and unsettling. Unease curdled in his stomach, but Jack, determined to make his new purchase work, continued to tinker with the settings, attempting to restore the console to its factory settings. His efforts were met with resistance, the console seemingly fighting back, the screen flashing with disturbing imagery, grotesque figures with hollow eyes and gaping maws flickering in and out of existence. Cold dread washed over Jack as he realized that this was no ordinary glitch.